Yeah, I've pretty much got it at 10 o'clock, so we'll make a start, if that's okay. Okay, thank you. Firstly, can I just remind everyone to turn off their mobile phones or other devices, or turn them to silent during the meeting. The meetings are paperless, and members of the council will be using their electronic devices to follow what's going on. There are members of the public upstairs watching our proceedings, and welcome to you. And we have some people to ask some questions a bit later on as well. So can I start by asking for any apologies?
We've had apologies from Councillor Dove.
I think everybody else is here, so that's good. The minutes of the last meeting, yes. Are you happy that they are a true and correct record of the meeting?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. Declarations of interest. Does any councillor have a declaration of interest to make on any subject that we're discussing today? No? Oh, sorry, Councillor Beasley?
Chairman, it's only just to remind the meeting, because I know it will be discussed on the agenda, but I'm a member of the Scheme Advisory Board.
Thank you. Then moving on swiftly to public participation, item number 4. We have 5 questions from 3 members of the public today. The first person I think submitted them is Kaz. Kaz Dunnett, did you want to start off and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. So the first question, it's quite a long preamble, but I'll try and get through it quickly. On the 14th of December 2021, a delegation from South West Action on Pensions, SWAP, and members of the Brunel Pension Partnership management team met together. During the meeting, Brunel's Chief Responsible Investment Officer, Faith Ward, strongly emphasised her commitment to their policy of engagement with fossil fuel-linked companies rather than to divesting funds from them. Although SWAP have a clear preference for rapid and total divestment, e.g. by the end of 2023, we are interested in how such engagement with fossil fuel investments might lead to some climate positive or net zero outcomes. In a recent podcast, David Vickers, who is the Chief Investment Officer at Brunel, who was also present at the meeting which I attended, said, "We believe in engagement, but there comes a point where if you are not having an impact, then you must divest." In 2021, Dr. Ellen Quidgley was commissioned by Cambridge University to research the advantages and disadvantages of fossil fuel divestment, and in doing so, to understand the efficacy of engagement versus divestment in terms of decarbonising their university's pension fund. The fund, totalling £3.5 billion, is the largest university endowment in Europe, and in 2019, 2.8% was still invested in the fossil fuel sector. Her research found that regarding shareholder engagement, on the basis of its historic evidence, it would not appear to be a sufficient tactic on its own for scale and speed of change required to decarbonise the fossil fuel sector. Furthermore, her report found, to be consistent with the Paris Agreement goal, a large majority of proven fossil fuel reserves would need to be left in the ground. So that's a third of oil reserves, half of gas reserves, and 80% of coal reserves. That's between a period of 2010 and 2050, in order to keep within a safe warming threshold. Research suggests that existing fossil fuel infrastructure, in addition to what is currently planned, permitted, or under construction, would already exceed the carbon budget needed to retain a 66% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees centigrade. So my question is, given that engagement seems very unlikely to work with fossil fuel companies when the core of their business is to extract and sell fossil fuels for financial gain, and that since 2018, all major gas and oil companies have approved projects that are not consistent with the Paris climate goals, will the Pension Committee ask Brunel Pension Partnership to provide incontrovertible evidence that their policy of engagement is effective in altering the core business models of the oil and gas giants that are set to destroy our planet?
Thank you for that question. Our response is the Dorset Pension Fund conducts a major review of its long-term investment strategy every 3 years. This process begins with an analysis of our overall funding position conducted by our actuaries, Barnett Waddingham. It will be based on the value of our assets on March the 31st, 2022. The results of this analysis will be forwarded to an independent advisor who will develop a strategy that best fits our long-term objectives. I would expect them to initially present a number of options, including the balance between equities and fixed income, UK and global investments, public and private markets, active versus passive, as well as taking into account the climate emergency. In addition, Brunel are undertaking a stock take of their approach to engagement and divestment. If this review concludes that companies are not taking appropriate action and significant steps to manage climate risks and to enable alignment with the Paris Climate Agreement, then the committee will need to reconsider its approach too. All of these factors will be considered by the Pension Fund Committee as part of the debate that will inform the development of a new strategy by the middle of next year.
Okay, so my second question. At the same meeting, SWAP asked Brunel to clarify where decision-making authority lies in terms of investment strategies and requirements. Brunel stated that decision-making power and outcomes rests with the pension funds themselves. Therefore, the local government pension scheme committees are the ultimate decision makers. We commend Dorset Council and the Pension Fund Committee for acting quickly and decisively to assess the morality of continued investment in Russian companies, likely to be predominantly oil and gas production companies, in response to their actions against Ukraine and its people. If the committee can do the right thing on this occasion, it demonstrates what can be done when moral obligation and political will come together. Global heating and its impact on climate change, coupled with environmental degradation, continues to be the greatest threat to our security, well-being, and even our very existence. It is an unenviable responsibility, but there is a moral duty as elected representatives to protect people and place to the best of your ability within the powers that are at your disposal. So my question is it now time to take a moral inventory of the pension fund portfolio and clean up the Dorset Pension Fund, not only to exclude those who wage war on other countries and their peoples, but also fossil fuel companies who persist with operations in the full knowledge that they are devastating life on Earth, and if not now, when? Thank you.
Yesterday, the Dorset Pension Fund conducted a training session with the Brunel Pension Partnership, where they outlined their new Paris-aligned portfolios and explained their rationale and objectives. This will undoubtedly inform part of the discussion that will take place when we design our new investment strategy. A significant duty of the Pension Fund Committee is to ensure that the contributions of scheme members and their employers to the pension fund are invested appropriately to make returns sufficient to pay benefits to scheme members. As part of the pension fund's next review, the matters you raise will be taken into consideration to see whether they present a financially material risk to returns or do not risk material financial detriment to the fund. This review is expected to take place over the next 12 months, following the results of the next triennial valuation of the pension fund's assets and liabilities by the fund's actuary. That concludes that. And over to Julianne Booker for your two questions.
Thanks, Chair. I'm asking my questions as a Dorset pension member. There's not a single justification to keep investing pension fund members and council taxpayers' money in planet-destroying fossil fuel companies. Divestment is morally, environmentally, and economically the right thing to do. Even the likes of BlackRock have said there is no financial drawback to divesting from fossil fuels. As a pensioner in the Dorset scheme, I feel terrible that my income is linked to these damaging companies. I want to see Dorset County Pension Fund do the only right thing: stop funding fossil fuel. Invest in our future, a genuinely green future for our children and grandchildren. This will also create good jobs and provide energy security, which we need now more than ever. On the 8th of September 2021, on behalf of Dorset Action on Pensions, I asked a question to Dorset Pensions Committee. My question asked how the committee would be amending their investment strategy in response to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report published on August the 9th, 2021. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said that the report signalled code red for humanity. In answer to this question, Councillor Andy Canning said that pension funds, by their very nature, are long-term investors seeking returns that will cover the pensions of its members. It is not in their nature to respond to short-term events. On the 22nd of February this year, the IPCC published their next report, and Antonio Guterres said, "I've seen many reports, but nothing like the new IPCC climate report, an atlas of human suffering and damning indictment of failed climate leadership. I know people everywhere are anxious and angry. I am too. It's time to turn rage into climate action." These reports are not short-term events. They are scientific predictions on long-term disaster if significant action is not taken now. If action is not taken now, there will be no long-term to invest in. Question: does the Dorset Pension Fund Committee understand that strategic investment decisions taken now will affect the long-term sustainability of the pension fund, and therefore agree to more rapidly remove all remaining fossil fuel-linked investments, i.e. faster than the planned 7% reduction each year?
We would be quite happy to ask the Brunel Pension Partnership to undertake a comprehensive analysis of alternative methods to achieve a long-term reduction in our exposure to fossil fuels and achieve a net zero carbon position before 2050. The matters you raise will be taken into consideration following the conclusion of Brunel's stocktake and as part of the next review of the investment strategy. But we believe that we have already made great strides in reducing the pension fund's exposure to fossil fuels without putting financial returns at risk. 10% of the pension fund's assets are now invested in Brunel's Global Sustainable Equities Fund, and all other actively managed Brunel funds are committed to a policy of a 7% year-on-year reduction in their carbon footprint. A Friends of the Earth report estimated that Dorset had £128 million invested in fossil fuel production in March 2019. By March 2021, this has fallen to approximately £41 million, which is now just 1.2% of total investment assets. Okay.
My next question. As a member of the Dorset Pension Fund, I'd like to know if the Pension Fund Committee is considering the allocation of passive funds in the Dorset scheme. I'm aware that Brunel Pension Partnership announced last summer that it has made a new Paris-aligned benchmark passive fund available to schemes within the Brunel pension pool. Question: will the Dorset Pension Fund Committee discuss this new fund and make a decision on allocating funds to it? And if so, at which committee meeting do you expect the decision to be considered? Thank you, Chair.
Yesterday, the Dorset Pension Fund conducted a training session with the Brunel Partnership, where they outlined their new Paris-aligned passive portfolios and explained their rationale and objectives. This will undoubtedly inform part of the discussions that will take place when we design our new investment strategy. We conduct a major review of our long-term investment strategy every 3 years. This process begins with an analysis of our overall funding position conducted by our actuaries, Barnett Waddingham. It will be based on the value of our assets in March 1st, 2022. The results of this analysis will be forwarded to an independent advisor who will develop a strategy that best fits our long-term objectives. I would expect them to initially present a number of options, including the balance between equities and fixed income, UK and global investments, public and private markets, active versus passive investments, as well as taking into account the climate emergency. All of these factors will be developed by the Pension Fund Committee, all these factors will be considered by the Pension Fund Committee as part of the debate that will inform the development of a new strategy by the middle of next year. And that concludes the answer for that one. For our fifth question, the member of the public is Councillor Ken Huggins, who can't be here today, so I ask David to read out the question.
Thank you, Chairman. This is a question from Councillor Ken Huggins of Hazel Bury Bryan Parish Council, and it's a question on decarbonising pension fund members' finances. Both Dorset Council and Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole Council clearly understand there is a climate and ecological crisis and have plans in place to tackle this on the local level. In an emergency, everyone must play their part, some more than others. Key drivers of climate change are the fossil fuel companies and the financial industry that supports them. And yet, fossil fuel companies and their shareholders still seek to profit from the destruction of our planetary systems. Dorset pension fund members are contributing to this destruction because their fund continues to invest their money in the fossil fuel industry, despite the two councils making efforts to ease the climate crisis by all other means available to them. It is no longer acceptable for the industry, banks or investors, such as local government pension schemes, to pass responsibility to each other or to the markets. Each participant must take full responsibility for the effects of their investments. Divestment also increasingly makes financial sense. Continued investment in fossil fuel is putting the pension fund at risk. That's members' money and council taxpayers' money that is at risk. However, the biggest risk that we must mitigate is the continuous increase in CO2 emissions from oil and gas extraction and consumption. A report by Make My Money Matter, October 2021, states that the UK pensions industry enables more CO2 than all UK carbon emissions. The report says pension scheme funds an estimated 330 million tonnes of carbon emissions every year. If the pensions industry were a country, it would find itself in the top 20 carbon emitters globally. Making your pension green is 21 times more powerful than giving up flying, going veggie, and switching energy provider. It is calling on people to tell their pension providers to go green. It's the most powerful thing you can do for the planet. Dorset Action on Pensions have looked closely at the research commissioned by Make My Money Matter in partnership with Aviva. It shows that pension fund divestment will effectively help decarbonise the personal finances for approximately 80,000 Dorset pension fund members. The positive impact in terms of CO2 reduction is immense. For every £1 invested in sustainable financial products instead of fossil fuels, a CO2e saving of 0.64 kilograms is made. It is an easy calculation to determine the tens of thousands of tonnes of carbon savings that will be made if the Dorset County Pension Fund divested. 0.64 kilograms times pounds invested by Dorset County Pension Fund in fossil fuel industry. The question is, will the committee now help pension fund members to decarbonise their finances by divesting from fossil fuel companies, releasing them from the heavy responsibility of contributing to huge carbon emissions?
And our answer, the Dorset Pension Fund is supportive of the declarations of a climate emergency by both Dorset Council and Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole Council. Significant decarbonisation has been and will continue to be achieved through the transition of assets to the management of the Brunel Pension Partnership, the pension fund's LGPS investment pooling manager. 10% of the fund's assets are now invested in Brunel's Global Sustainable Equities Fund, and all the other actively managed Brunel funds are committed to a policy of a 7% year-on-year reduction in their carbon footprint. A Friends of the Earth report estimated that Dorset had £128 million invested in fossil fuel production in March 2019. By March 2021, this had fallen to approximately 41 million, which is just 1.2% of total investment assets. We conduct a major review of our long-term investment strategy every 3 years. This process begins with an analysis of our overall funding position conducted by our actuaries Barnett Waddingham. It will be based on the value of our assets on March 31st, 2022. The results of this analysis will be forwarded to an independent advisor who will develop a strategy that best fits our long-term objectives. I would expect them to initially present a number of options, including the balance between equities and fixed income, UK and global investments, public and private markets, active versus passive investments, as well as taking into account the climate emergency. All of these factors will be considered by the Pension Fund Committee as part of the debate that will inform the development of a new strategy by the middle of next year. Thank you very much. That concludes the questions from members of the public. Thank you. lift a bag.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming along today to ask those questions. Item 5 deals with questions from members. I believe we don't have any.
That's correct, Chairman.
Item 6 is urgent items. And I propose at this point to have a discussion on the situation in Russia. Clearly, I think I'll speak on behalf of everybody here, that we are all disgusted by the behaviour of Russia and its unwarranted and illegal war on Ukraine. It has had a huge impact globally. I think there's like estimated 2 million people are now refugees, and that number is only likely to increase. It's totally wrong what Putin has done, and I'm sure we all condemn that. I think we are relatively fortunate in that we have a relatively limited exposure to Russia. Those of you who've seen the numbers, basically we have 5% of our investments in Brunel's Global Emerging Markets Fund, and 3% of that fund is was invested in Russia. So at the last valuation, I think that amounted to 0.13% of our total investments, but that's about £5 million. Brunel are committed to divesting them from Russia and getting the money out as soon as possible. But obviously there are going to be difficulties with that, bearing in mind how often the markets have been closed, the amounts of regulation that have been introduced, fines for trying to move money overseas, and the whole range of things which make it much more difficult. But I think it'd be fair to ask Brunel if they want to give us a latest update on any position. Luke? So it's Luke O'Donnell from Brunel.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I believe my colleague Tim Dixon has mailed Dave Wilkes this morning regarding the situation with Russia, but just to highlight, with regards to Russia, in the run-up to the crisis, we were underweight with any Russian exposure. That was due to the risks we perceived there. The managers that we employ had already instigated the process of selling those assets, but as you've referred to, getting rid of those assets proved quite troublesome. The administrator of the fund has had written down the value of those assets by 90%, and I think in the communication that we've put out this morning, they have now been written down to 0. So it is, as you've mentioned, a disgusting situation over there. Fortunately, we were underweight. We have your members have limited exposure, but there has been a minor hit to the assets under management.
Thank you. Councillor Wolf, I believe you want to make a statement.
Thank you. 2 or 3 things. First of all, it sounds like a police record. For the benefit of the tape, could the gentleman from Brunel introduce himself? Do it when I've done, because this is being recorded and people may be watching. On behalf of the committee, I hope you don't mind. I thought our chairman did an excellent job in responding to the various questions, and I thought that was very clear, and I think we can be proud of the work we are doing. And I do hope that we actually manage to get some communications out on this, because I think we are at the forefront of climate change in progress in what we're doing in many areas. So I thank the chair for that. And the Russia-Ukraine response, I think, is worth perhaps trying to develop some communications, because it is a question that a number of people have asked me. We are rather limited by what the government will or will not let us do, but the fact is, in terms of our investment profile, I believe we are far better than most of the pension organisations. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Peter. Howard Legg, Councillor Howard Legg.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just a query or a follow-up from that. Am I correct in saying that you value the assets at 0 now, but you still have them? They're still under ownership?
The assets are still under ownership. They are valued at 0. And coming back to the councillor's question, I ought to introduce myself. My name is Luke O'Donnell. I've worked for Brunel for a number of months. I have worked in investment management industry for about 30 years. And 2 years before I joined Brunel, I was working for a small investment consultant in Bristol, covering a swathe of asset classes, so equities, bonds, multi-asset funds, private markets, and liability-driven investment.
Thank you. It reminds me of the situation, my wife's parents had Chinese government bonds in a display. And these bonds date back to the situation in the Chinese Revolution in the last century. They've never been paid, they've never been redeemed, no one's ever had their money back, but they still exist, but they're totally worthless, except as collector's items. And it may well be that the situation in Russia, we never get the money back, but we will be doing our best, obviously, to get what we can get back. If Putin was replaced in the near future by a different style of Russian government, I would be optimistic we would get the money back. But if Putin stays the leader for any length of time, the chances of Western companies being allowed to take money out of Russia are very, very limited. Did anybody else have any questions or anything they wanted to say? Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I welcome the updates that we've had from Brunel and the fact that our exposure to Russian investments was very minimal, at about 0.13%, about £5 million from what we were told, and now that is effectively just at the value of the paper that those investments are written on. And I think that's a good thing, and it probably sort of backs up our investment strategy anyway, that we make sure, you know, that we do look at the sort of risks of our investment, and our Brunel on our behalf do manage the risk of our investments, that we have such a small exposure to Russian investments. So I welcome that update, and I'm confident that Brunel will keep us updated with the sort of divestment of what is left of our Russian investments over time. And just in relation to what some sort of colleagues have said, and thank you for your answers to the public questions just now, and thank you to the public actually for continuing to raise those questions and continuing to keep it on our agenda. And as I've said to some people, I think pretty much every Dorset Pension Fund meeting I've been to, we've discussed divestment of fossil fuel investments, and decarbonisation, and where our decarbonisation strategy is getting us to. And it just occurs to me really that it's very much around communication, isn't it? That I've been quite pleased over the few years I've been involved with Dorset Pension Fund about our decarbonisation agenda and our investment strategy, and the figures you gave earlier, that it looks like we've reduced from about 4% of fossil fuel investments in March 2019 to about 1.2% of our fund. You know, it's moving fairly rapidly in that direction, dwarfed by the investment we have in sort of sustainable investments, you know, through the Global Sustainable Equities Fund. And, you know, we've been given at our meeting specific examples of those sorts of investments in terms of, you know, renewable energy, etc. So I think really it's a lot about communication about what Dorset Pension Fund is doing with our members' money to decarbonise and to address that. It's not specifically looking at that small element of fossil fuel investments, but it's looking at the whole investment fund and where the whole 100% is moving. As part of, you mentioned the investment strategy review, as part of that, it would be interesting to know, now that we're down to around £41 million invested in fossil fuels, how straightforward and easy it would be to divest that final element in fossil fuel investment, and what impact that may have on the portfolio, the overall portfolio, because it strikes me that now we're down to that level of about 1%. Any divestment of fossil fuel investments will have very little impact on the investment performance or the overall performance of our entire fund. So,
thank you for those comments, Councillor Brown. Yes, I think the point that I was stressing in the answer to the questions was that we will consider everything as part of the review. There are no things that won't be on the table. So I'm sure whoever we end up being our advisor for this process we will look at all the options and we'll be specifically encouraged to look at all the options available so that everything is analysed properly and we can make very clear why we've made the decisions that we've made. I think in answer to the questions that we had in our training yesterday about governance issues and making sure we do the right thing, I think one of the point I got clearly from that was that the importance of having good reasons for why you're doing what you're doing and then explaining them clearly to the public. It doesn't always mean, of course, that everybody would agree with those decisions, but yeah, the important thing is communication, you're right, and let people know what we're doing and why we're doing it in particular. Councillor Roberts.
Thank you, Chairman. Yesterday, during the training of the pension, it clarified, I think, to some of us that the members of a local authority scheme, the Dorset Pension Scheme, will continue to receive their pensions regardless of the state of the fund. The pensions are guaranteed. My understanding is that if there is a shortfall in the reserves, that the employers, which are principally the two councils, will need to make up the shortfall, which could put essential services at risk, such as adult social care, childcare. Surely the primary duty of the committee is to ensure adequate returns from our investments to cover our liabilities. And I sometimes think that we are losing the fact that this duty must take primacy over social and economic goals. I wonder what you think about that.
I think there is a big potential debate to be had about the word primary and how it applies to this situation. And I think, yes, obviously you're correct. If we don't succeed in investments giving us greater return as we would want them to, the council taxpayer is the ultimate backstop and the group that would have to make up any shortfall. But I think it's still a debate about whether going in a more green approach increases, decreases, or has no effect on our ability to have returns. And I think that's what I'm sure one of the major debates that we'll have will be focused on that. I deliberately steered away from using the word primary in the answers to the questions there. In one of the drafts, it said that. Because if I read what Peter Scales was saying yesterday, I don't think you can use the word primary. Perhaps we'll address that issue later on as well. But I think it's clearly a very important part of what we're doing and going on. Anyway, I feel like we're straying a bit away from Russia, which was the subject here. Does anybody else have anything else they want to say on Russia specifically? No? In which case, thank you very much for that. And speaking of Peter Scales, it's over to you for your Independent Governance Annual Report.
Thank you, Chairman. Do you want me to introduce myself? I'm Peter Scales. I'm the Independent Governance Advisor to the Fund on behalf of MJ Hudson. And I've been advising the committee for some years now on this. My report starts really on page 14 in your papers, and the headline message, which is the message I give you most years, is that good standards are still being maintained by the committee. And at the moment, that's in spite of the distraction of the pandemic. And so you've adapted your meetings, as I've mentioned there, to work. They're not the best way of meeting, I don't find. Even today, we're finding practical difficulties in holding discussion because we're cutting each other off. But you've made that work, and that's not affected the way in which you're operating. Paragraph 2.4, admittedly with the benefit of hindsight, I've commented on a discussion which started in the November meeting about staffing terms and conditions, which I would have suggested should have been moved to part 2 of the agenda, but it's easy for me to say that with hindsight. In terms of the business of the committee, and I looked through all the committee reports and minutes of each meeting, I quite like and I commend the links that are given in the papers to various pieces of legislation or guidance or articles. I think that's very useful for the committee to have that as background. The only point I've made there is I feel that with the pension board, I still think their minutes should be brought to this committee for consideration, if only just to keep you up to date with what they're looking at in their meetings. And that's what happens at a number of other funds that I'm involved with. On page 15, in terms of the annual report, which is as good as it always is, I've suggested there may be that there should be a summary from the report of the local pension board included in the annual report. And this, in fact, I do this with West Sussex, just a brief one-page report, which is included alongside the report of yourself as chairman. And also with West Sussex, I do a very brief report that goes into the pensioner newsletter. This just gives them some information about the operation of the board. In terms of regulation and guidance, I've given a long list of things which are out there which aren't going anywhere at the moment. A former sort of tsunami of different things which are coming through, particularly the good governance review. I understand there's going to be a consultation before the summer recess. I don't know whether that's definite or not, but that's been going on now for some time. And the Scheme Advisory Board issued their proposals over a year ago to the government to consider, and nothing, as far as I'm aware, has come out of that yet. But I do suggest that it may be a point now when some form of interim assessment could be made based on the Hyman's recommendations. But I say that in a year when there's an awful lot of work being faced by the pensions team. So it's not the best time to be introducing that. But I've a feeling there will be lots of things coming forward in this current year. Just turning over to page 16, I've mentioned the Sit for Pensions panel there, particularly because that has been an integral part of the guidance that's issued and therefore part of compliance. That guidance has always been drafted by the Sit for Pensions panel. That panel has now been disbanded. Scheme Advisory Board has stepped up to the plate and appointed, just very recently, a compliance and reporting committee, and I think that will be chaired by somebody from SITFA. But I think it's too early yet to know how that will work in this governance sort of framework. So I will be concerned to see how that's taken forward. I've mentioned there the Levelling Up paper, which again is new, and there's bits coming out about that as the days go by. I suppose the only point I would make there is that it seems to be being treated that local equals the UK, but then we've heard that many times before, back in 2001, in 2015, where funds have been encouraged to invest in either private equity or infrastructure or something like that. So no doubt there will be something more coming on that. In terms of the pensions regulator in paragraph 6, they're beginning to become more proactive, I think, about the way in which they're supervising the pension funds, but they still refer to public sector pensions and don't differentiate between the LGPS as a funded scheme and the other schemes which aren't. And I find that's quite confusing, although I think it may assist the regulator in blurring the edges of their guidance. They're introducing a combined code that's been reported to you at previous committees. That's now due to come out and come into force in the autumn, which is still some way away, but there will be ramifications for LGPS schemes, I'm sure, new requirements placed upon you. So in paragraph 7, I've just given some conclusions similar to previous years. I have no concerns about the governance of this fund. I think it works very well. And despite the pandemic, as I've said, there has been problems with the Civica administration system, which I've seen in the reports. From the outside, they seem to me as teething problems. I know at least one other fund that uses Civica and are very pleased with it. So these are teething problems, but they're obviously problems on the ground that are very serious and have got to be dealt with. I think the governance framework, as I've suggested, is in for significant changes with the Good Governance Review. How they will pan out, I'm not sure. And really just the sort of comment I usually make is there's a lot of noise going on at the moment. And okay, we've had the pandemic, but there's little action from some of the regulatory bodies. And in particular, I pick out the DOUHC at that. The Scheme Advisory Board has been working to try and get some of these things moving, but we now have a bottleneck, and I fear that a lot of these are going to come out in the coming months, and there will be almighty pressure on the administration, even on the investment side, to deal with some of the new guidance that will emerge. That's all I had to say, Chair. I'm happy to take any questions, of course.
Thank you, Peter. A really good, thorough report, as always. Thank you very much. Councillor Wharf.
Well, thank you for the report. The question is possibly to our own officers. In the report, you say Civica has caused, sorry, I'm struggling a bit. Civica has caused some problems, but they appear to be on the mend. I exaggerate, and I wonder whether an officer, because Civica has had its problems in implementation across the piece, and as something of an ex-IT person, I just want to check that this is under control, that it is going to get better, we are aware of the issues, and it will not affect our performance, please.
Okay, I was going to say, Karen, is this one of the issues that will be in your report anyway? Yeah, okay, we'll do it then.
Thank you.
Peter.
Can I just add that, I mean, I've been involved with several switches of administration systems over the years, and it is always a traumatic event because of the data. I mean, there's just so much of it, different systems. So I didn't actually say it was improving. What I said is it's being handled from the reports that I read, and I think that's right, but I don't want to take anything away from the pressure that that's causing. But other reports I have is that Civica is working well for other funds.
Thank you for that clarification, I think, yes. Any other questions? Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, thank you for the that governance update report. I was particularly interested in the second paragraph and the comments about the Levelling Up white paper. And what does it say in the report about the white paper makes reference to the case for LGPS funds to support levelling up through local projects, suggesting that we allocate 5% to local investing, quite whatever that is. I think that's opened my eyes a bit, and it's quite interesting. And it comes back to the discussion we've just been having about, well, what is our responsibility? It's to deliver the returns necessary to fund the payment of pensions to our members, obviously alongside social responsibilities that we have. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops. That actually is the Levelling Up white paper going to say LGPS funds have a social responsibility to invest locally to support the levelling up agenda of the government, alongside all of our other responsibilities. So yeah, that's an interesting insight into what that sort of paper's saying.
Thank you. Picking on what Peter was saying earlier on, though, when it says local, does that mean the whole of the UK? Or you talk about Dorset Fund investing in Dorset?
I'm sorry, Chair, you're asking me about something I don't really know. I'm only telling you what I've read in comments that are coming through in the press. And I think using the phrase local to be defined as UK-wide has led to further comments about, does that exclude London and the South East, where levelling up is not thought to be necessary? So there's a whole myriad of issues that can come out of the use of these phrases. I think the purpose, as I read it from the Levelling Up white paper, is the government wants pension funds, not just LGPS, but pension funds, to use their assets to help meet government policies in terms of levelling up. So I think that is obviously local, being UK and not overseas. And maybe that comes from issues that happen with infrastructure, where pension funds are asked to invest in infrastructure. Many invested in overseas infrastructure because that was the better investment, which didn't meet the criteria that were put at the time. But these are just my personal judgments on that.
David, I believe you had something to add.
I think Peter may have answered it, but I think in question to Councillor Brown's question, I think the one thing that has been clarified is that local means UK-wide and not within the administering authorities area or regional or whatever. But I think there's still, clearly we still need to see a lot more detail as to what this actually means for pension funds. And I suspect it will be another thing that we'll need to take into consideration once we're reviewing our investment strategy. So once we've got a clearer steer as to what this actually means for pension funds, for local government pension scheme funds, then I think it will be something that we'll incorporate into the review as well.
Thank you. Though I suspect that we're already considerably higher than the 5% I think that's been talked about there. But Councillor Beasley.
I was just going to add, from the point of view of the Scheme Advisory Board, who last met on Monday this week, and obviously the Levelling Up White Paper was an agenda item. It's probably not an exaggeration to say that the details are as clear as mud at the moment. But of course, the Scheme Advisory Board is doing its very best to coordinate with government, which is part of its role, to try and get greater clarity so that schemes can understand what is likely to be required of them. My personal interpretation thus far is that actually the white paper is necessarily vague on the subject because the government is testing the water. That is what I think is happening, a little bit perhaps like they did with regard to infrastructure back in 2015 or so, when they tried to panic pension funds into believing that they were going to be required to effectively bankroll infrastructure projects through the LGPS, and that was fiercely resisted and successfully resisted, I'm pleased to say. Of course, we're in a different place today, and one of the issues feeding into this is the issue around working with asset pools to publish plans for increasing local investment. Local, very definitely, as far as the SAB were concerned, was countrywide rather than outside of the country. But of course, we've all got our own infrastructure asset allocations, and our allocation is 8%. We're not there yet, but we're working towards it. And private equity, of course, would need to be pulled apart to see if any of that applied as well. So I think we're a long way off having to do anything, but we will be asked to publish plans. And I think the strong recommendation is that we begin to prepare for that, because government quite rightly would be able to say otherwise, why haven't you done it? What are your reasoning? And I think we would be left wanting if that would happen. But in the meantime, I'm quite happy to keep committee updated as work comes through from the SAB. It's early days, but we need to be very conscious that if we're not properly prepared for it, government may try to steamroller us into things that we don't want to do, invest in assets that we perhaps wouldn't voluntarily do otherwise, and therefore I think they will be taking very close notice of what the SAB have got to say on the subject as the lead for the LGPS.
Thank you, Councillor Beasley. I certainly agree with all those remarks. But I also think that it shouldn't really be UK-wide. I mean, if you talk about levelling up, it doesn't seem much of a case to me to invest in London or the southeast of England. they really don't need the money, and they seem to get a very high percentage of the capital projects that the country undertakes already anyway. But that, of course, is a personal opinion. Anything else for Peter? Is it sure?
Thank you, Councillor Beasley. Councillor Beasley and I are old enough to remember when the discussions about moving over to Brunel took place. Councillor Beasley is far more polite than I would be. We came under incredible pressure from government, A, to pool our resources into Brunel, as it turned out, but the pooling of resources was what we were under pressure to do, and B, to use those pooled resources to invest in infrastructure funds that would support the government. We fought that extremely strongly because that's the wrong way around in determining what we invest in. Our investment decisions are based on returns and other things, as we discussed earlier, and I am just putting down a marker that any instruction by government as to we should help them out in terms of their investment strategy, that doesn't necessarily meet our investment strategy. And I think the discussions we had earlier tell me that we do need to have a further discussion on our investment strategy. But until I change, I am absolutely not going to agree to meet the government's suggested requirements for investment, because they've got their own requirements and their own thoughts. So I'm just putting down a marker that I think this committee needs to be quite strong and not to give way to government in terms of what their desire is in order to pay for their bills, which are likely to be quite high as we go forward. Thank you, Chairman.
Absolutely, I think you're quite right to make those comments, and I'm sure we will resist any attempt to the government to tell us what to do. Aidan, I believe you had some comments to that.
Thank you. Good morning. Aidan Dunn, Chief Finance Officer for Dorset Council, and that's for the pension fund. First of all, thank you, Peter, for the report. Really encouraging and comforting in many ways. I just want to pick up Peter's comment about section 5.2, the good governance review, and Peter's suggestion that we do a stock take ahead of any sort of formal announcement from government on a consultation. We have commissioned that stock take, and our intention is that at the next meeting we'll come with an independent stock take of how we are against those recommendations and an action plan for Dorset Council pension, Dorset County Pension Fund around that. And so we'll integrate that into Karen's report at the next meeting. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. That's really helpful. Anything else finally, Peter? No? In which case, thank you very much for that. It's very good. Moving on then to item 8, Pensions Administration Report. Over to you, Karen, as our Pensions Manager.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm Karen Gibson. I'm the Service Manager for Pensions, looking after the administration. Can you all hear me okay? Bend it over. Is that a bit better? Okay. Okay. This is the administration report, and I'll start off with the first item, which is the key performance indicators. And you'll know from our last meeting that these have been impacted, of course, by a change in system and by the fact that we have a lot of staffing shortages at the moment. There is on month improvement that we can see. But the improvement isn't going to, go from A to Z overnight. Unfortunately, it is going to take us some months and some time to recover from both the change in system and the backlogs of work that obviously provoked, and get our staffing back to normal levels. I would expect some slight improvement each month. But it's going to take us quite a long time, I should imagine, to get back to the position we were prior to our new system being implemented. Is there any questions on that before I move on to the system? Just to give you an update on the system, and things have moved on since I wrote this report. There is enormous progress. We have achieved an awful lot, and the system that we have got will fit us much better for the future, certainly for home working and that sort of thing. We've got a much better system than we had before, but it's a lot of work. It's not an overnight thing that you can press a button and off you go. There's a lot of work, and there's a lot of work still to do, but we are making exceptional progress with that. Some particular areas of concern we have raised directly with Civica, and they have responded well and given us additional resource, which was what we needed to deal with specific items, particularly where it involved specialist LGPS knowledge. That was particularly hard for them to resource because of their own resourcing issues that they have, but they are coming to the fore. They came down and spent 2-3 days with us in the office. Well, of course, we've onboarded this new system completely remotely. Having people on site and on a visit made such a difference. It made you realise quite how hard it was doing everything remotely. And that really did benefit us enormously. And I think in part that they could understand more the problems that we had, which were sometimes quite technical, and they've gone away and there has been huge progress. So we are making huge progress. We have been able to upload our valuation data to the Barnett-Waddingham data checker. This is really, really essential because this is the data that's fed into our valuation, and it has to be as accurate as it can be. And there was over 6,000 errors, of which really only a handful were what I consider to be proper errors. We've done an enormous amount of work checking our data to make sure that, for example, what was quoted on a benefit statement last year is going to be the same this year. After the new system has come into play. So we are literally checking thousands and thousands and thousands of errors, and we are getting to a really good place. So I feel confident going into the valuation specifically that our data will be of good quality and as good quality as it was previously. Doesn't mean that we still don't have a few struggles. We do. We're still working on quite a few things. But I'm very optimistic that we will get there with Civica and we have a good working relationship with them. Has anybody got any questions in regard to the system?
Sorry, your question was, anybody got any question with regards to the Civica system or? Sorry, Yes. Yeah. Can I just refer back? You may not have said improving, but you said recovering. So that sounds like improving to me, and I'm still not entirely clear what steps we're going to take if we don't recover. So I'm sorry, I'm still slightly twitchy about it, and you haven't said anything to make me not twitchy.
I think you're absolutely right to be concerned because this is a huge, huge thing. No fund would undergo what we have done lightly. There are only 2 system providers in the UK that can actually provide a system for the LGPS administration. So there's very limited choice out there, which sort of reflects the absolute complexity and size of what we're dealing with. Otherwise, there'd be lots of people on board. I think be reassured that we have very regular contact with Civica, and that Dorset Council is supporting us in any issues that we have with them. And it's very, very closely monitored. So we have weekly meetings with them to address any ongoing issues, and that is monitored as well. So obviously I'm only giving you a brief overview, but if you need any more detail, just let me know, because there's a lot going on. But it's not a case that we are on our own. They are working with us still very, very much. So, you know, I do feel confident that we have made huge strides. And I mean, even last week, the employer portal, which is really important for the LGPS, because the LGPS is a real challenge for employers. And if employers get things wrong, they're the ones that give us data, then our data for our valuations and for payment of our benefits is wrong. So we spend a lot of time getting this portal. Not every fund provides the portal that we have got. And even last week, there were some improvements delivered to that portal for employers, certainly that were not there in our previous portal and could never have been achieved, so that they can reassign work, for example, and that sort of thing, and be automatically notified of leavers. So, you know, we've got a really good modern system. Does that help at all? Yeah.
Just, could you switch yours off? Thank you. Can I request that the 151 officer, because I appreciate the comments, but I just want some mechanism that members are informed if there's any worsening or non-improvement when we expected it of the situation. Because what I don't want is to get to the next pensions committee in 3 months' time and find, as they say in the trade, it's gone to custard. I don't think it will, but I like some mechanism that we are kept informed of it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. So as Karen's outlined, this is a big project, there's a programme around it, there's a project plan and a project board that are meeting regularly, and Jim's our sort of senior officer on that. I think there's two things. The metrics, the performance indicators, are clearly not of where they were on the old system. So that's our measure of improvement. So we'll continue to monitor those and report those here. But clearly behind the scenes that we can provide sort of interim updates to the whole committee if they'd welcome that as well. It is, I mean, we're in a pace of gradual improvement and we want to accelerate that.
Thank you. Yes, I think Aidan's part, I was going to ask, or maybe it will be covered when we look at the KPIs, how many of those were directly as a result of the problems with the system rather than perhaps staff shortages or over too many inquiries, or it was really clarification that they were a system issue rather than a not catching up. Thank you.
Karen, do you want to comment on that?
Yes, I mean, that's quite difficult when looking at the KPIs, because there's different things going on there. There is the fact that we've recovered from the change of our system and working through, but that created backlogs. And so now the staff are much more equipped and the system is working well, but we do have an issue now where we've got huge staff shortages in key areas. So it's quite difficult to say of the KPIs what is the cause of one and the other, because you need the staff to deal with the backlogs. And at the moment, we are having to focus on retirement benefits and death benefits and transfers. Those are important areas, and some areas are being left purely because we don't have the physical resource to do them. That's not because of the system, that's just because of staff shortages. So we are doing everything that we can there, obviously, to deal with those problems. But I'm not sure whether I'll be able to actually separate, when it comes to the KPIs, what is because of one cause or another.
Thank you. I don't want to stray into problematic ground, which we did last time with the salary situation, staffing situation. But like Councillor Wolf has just said, though, I think there could be some reassurance for the committee that staffing is being monitored and is being somewhere looking at how to deal with this issue and make sure things are not getting any worse, certainly, and maybe getting better.
So if I could comment on that, I'm sort of mindful of the sensitivities, but since the last meeting, we've set up a project team from Dorset Council's HR team and the organisational development team to sort of wrap round and support the pensions admin team, and in particular to support Karen. What we're looking at, we're doing, we did touch on salaries last time. We've commissioned a benchmarking survey to see what grading and salaries other employees in the area are paying. We're looking at training and development. We're looking at the impact that working remotely has had and continues to have. And as Karen's just described, the new system is quite beneficial in that way. So we've got a package of measures, but I do sort of reiterate the point that I made last time, that yes, this is challenging for pensions, but this is happening in all parts of the council at the moment in terms of recruitment challenges. For example, within the Dorset Council's finance team, we've advertised and tried to recruit to a finance post on 4 occasions, and we're just not getting the applications. There's a real sense of sort of post-pandemic, the employment market is really challenging. So we're trying to think differently and recruit differently, right the way through to investing in in sort of raising our social media presence to try and attract people in a different way than our more traditional ways of recruitment. So it's something that we're alive to. We're providing support to Karen and her team as we can, and I'll continue to keep you briefed as a committee.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you. Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, on a slightly different subject. Thanks, Karen, for the update report on the system. And your comments then about the employer portal in paragraph 12.3 in the report talks about the employer portal. So obviously it sounds like that's a big benefit of having the new system. And obviously as the pension fund committee, as well as members, the employers are one of our big sort of clients, so to speak. It's just sort of ongoing, any sort of processes in place for how we get feedback from employers about their use of the portal and any issues and any sort of amendments or adjustments that are needed to that. And I don't want to sort of cause work to sort of start thinking about that, but just something more formal than a sort of just informally, you know, I think employers have welcomed these, but I think we need to be alive to the fact that we need their feedback ongoing to sort of to develop the system and to make sure it delivers the benefits that we all hope.
Thank you. Karen, do you want to make any comments on that, and then you can carry on with the rest of the report?
Yes, we have a really good working relationship with our employers, and we always meet with them 3 times a year anyway with an employer meeting, and we keep in touch with them monthly by a monthly news update for them, and we have a dedicated team to support them. What we did going into the change of portal for them was we had a working group of employers that volunteered to be there, and they were able to give us some feedback before the portal went live. And I have to say their feedback was really valuable because they've got such a different perspective than we have. And these changes that are coming through now have come from feedback from our employers. So we're really lucky, actually. In Dorset, we have a few employers particularly that really work closely with us and give us feedback. Okay, I'll move on to item 13. That's the pensions dashboard programme. Just to make you aware of this, it's been going along for a little while now. It was announced in the 2016 budget as a government's plan that there would be a national dashboard. And this will enable everybody in the country to log on to one central place and view any pension entitlements they may have, including the state pension. So this idea has gone forward. There's a pensions dashboard programme looking at the digital architecture and all the complexities around providing that. And obviously the LGPS is one of many pension funds across the country working towards this. As you can imagine, it poses a huge challenges, technical challenges. There's a lot of concern over the data protection and who owns the data. There will be something in between the dashboard and the administration of each individual pension scheme. So there will be something in between. Members log on to a dashboard and they can request a current value of their pension. So that could be deferred or active members. So there's a lot of work going on with this. Sort of one of our primary concerns really is the timing, which is coming in at about the time when McLeod regulation should be out, and we're working towards looking to have a lot of changes in our software and a lot of communication needs because of McLeod. I've just fed back to the consultation on the pensions dashboard because it's really important, I think, to make sure that it is useful for all types of members. The LGPS are quite different to other public sector schemes for many reasons, one of them being that we have a lot of unpaid refunds, a huge number, which if you look at, say, the fire scheme, for example, they don't tend to have that. It's a very different workforce in the LGPS, a lot of smaller pensions and a transient workforce. So we're trying to make sure that the dashboard is useful and looking at things like the amount of context that we can apply to that. The dashboard also is very ambitious and has suggested that we can include alternative benefits that take into account the McLeod remedy. And I did see a paper recently from the fire scheme saying that, you know, perhaps that's going to be a little bit ambitious, as is the time frame. At the moment, we'll be in early onboarding, which starts in 2023. And then we will go on board at some point after that So I'll keep you updated with progress on that. We're currently looking at the options available for somebody to supply us with the digital architecture that will enable us to connect securely with the dashboard, and looking at that. A little bit more complexity, of course, for the LGPS scheme and for all pension schemes. So we'll wait and see, and I'll keep you updated on that. Does anybody have any questions about the pension dashboard programme? No. Item 14 is an employer update. I think the last update I gave you was in June 2021, and this is just a summary of new employers that have come into the Dorset Fund and some that are leaving. And you'll see that we have got 5 new employers coming into the scheme. So these tend to be where, for example, a school or an authority outsources a contract. Sometimes for things like cleaning. You can see 2 of these are to do with cleaning for a school, and they outsource that contract. And that involves the TUPE transfer of some staff and the creation of admission agreement and a new employer to the scheme. So we liaise very closely with the scheme, with all new employers in the scheme, and those go ahead. It usually goes ahead quite smoothly. And there's 2 employers leaving the scheme. You can see one in November and one in September. Does anybody have any questions in regard to that?
Thank you very much. I don't wish to discuss this in detail, but you have a new admitted body of Tricuro Limited, and there are a number of actions taking place. And I just want you to be aware of the potential actions and the fact that you may need to review our working with this organisation. I certainly don't want to get into detail, but I just want you to assure me that you are aware of a variety of pieces of comms that went out 2 days ago, which actually describe some of the things that we're thinking of. Thank you.
Okay, just to move on to item... Sorry.
Yes, just to confirm that that I and we are aware of the changes. I think it's just the admitted body status. It's such a dynamic position anyway, as with TUPE and what have you. But I'll take Karen through the detail of the proposed changes. Thank you.
Okay, item 15, just to let you know, there's an awful lot going on in the wider pensions industry about transfers and restrictions on transfers. This is as a result of the increase of financial scams that has been going on, particularly in the last couple of years, and a number of which have impacted pensions and people's personal savings. We don't see a lot of this in the LGPS, but it can happen. So there's a lot of guidance that we have to now follow in terms of doing checks on certain transfers. So, for example, if someone were to transfer from a scheme like ours to the NHS or civil service, those types of transfers are very transparent, and they have little change to our previous practices. The transfers into personal pensions have to be looked at very closely, and a series of additional checks and forms and completions have to take place before those transfers can take place. Sometimes this isn't met very kindly by the person that might want to transfer their pension, and you have to explain that you have to go through checks to make sure that their pension is secure and safe, and they're not likely to lose it inadvertently. So just to let you know that the Dorset Pension Fund has undertaken a lot of training with the pensions regulator to make sure that we are covered with that, and the LGA has produced new templates and further guidance to assist us in order to prevent any transfers that should not have taken place. Item 16 is the finance bill that has recently gone through in November. There's a few things that are relevant to the LGPS here. Firstly, changes to annual allowance scheme pays deadlines. That will be notified in our communications and to anyone impacted by that. One thing that will impact the scheme and will add a further layer of complexity when we go forward is the increase in the normal minimum pension age. So currently somebody can draw their pension in the LGPS once they leave their employment from age 55, or a deferred beneficiary can draw from age 55, and this is increasing to 57 from 2028. Members of uniform services pension schemes are exempt from this change. That was a recent change to the original consultation. There will be protections for members. So if a member is in a scheme and has a normal minimum pension age of 55, they will have protections. The details and complexity around that, how does that impact transfers, for example, will come out in legislation going forward. So there's a few formalities to go through. We need the Secretary of State to confirm that these changes will take place for the LGPS, and then there will be consultations and legislation and new regulations going forward. So like with a lot of the changes in the LGPS that come along, they become legacy things. So there will be a group of members with a minimum retirement age of 55 and some with 57. And there's also some changes in that bill in regard to concern that has been raised over the tax impacts, and these are pensions tax for lifetime allowance and annual allowance of the MacLeod remedy. So there's a lot of engagement with HMRC about that and what will happen. So that's definitely a huge complex area for a lot of public sector schemes. Item 17 concerns local pension board, and many of you will, sorry, I've got a question. Oh, it's about this, okay. Many of you will be aware that we are lucky enough on the pension board to have Paul Kent, a former county treasurer, as our current chair. The situation in the local pension board is that the chair is somebody that is nominated within the board, and that has been how we have operated since the inception of the local pension boards. What has become apparent is that many other authorities have an independent chair, that is a paid independent chair. And I've been aware for some while that Paul will be leaving us soon. And I think his experience and knowledge has made a big difference to the local pension board in many, many ways. The suggestion that I've got here of a proposal is that we now look to appoint an independent remunerated chair, and here we're asking for approval for that.
This obviously is 2 points. Have we tried to get a chairman that is in the same status as an unremunerated? And I do not see how we can possibly approve a proposal without knowing what the remuneration might be offered. And I think it's essential that we are given that information before we can approve a proposal. Otherwise, it's a blank check.
No, we haven't looked to see if there's anybody willing. I'm sure that there would be somebody willing in the board to take on that role. I think what this is a change of thinking, particularly with the challenges going forward in terms of governance and the huge changes that there are. That in actual fact that we need that independent paid chair, even if someone were willing to chair, it's the knowledge that is so valuable. And you don't always get, the board members are made up of employer member representatives, but they don't obviously come necessarily with the experience and knowledge that would be so valuable. And of course, many of them are working full-time elsewhere. And it is quite something that would benefit very, very much from somebody having the time as well as the expertise to devote to it. And I think that would make a difference to myself and my colleagues that do a lot of the background work currently. We are aware, I don't know if it's appropriate to say what the remuneration would be before the job description is finalised. So I'm not really sure about that, whether you want me to quote what it is likely to be in the basis of other authorities.
Yeah, I don't think we can, it's really relevant for our work to know the exact sum. Well, Councillor Legge was supposed to say that, and then yourself. So, sorry.
Thank you very much, Chair. Mine was on the same topic, actually. It was this remuneration, because in 17.3, you seem to give the reasons or the justification for doing it because other authorities do it, not because we would necessarily not get a good enough chair if we didn't remunerate them. And I don't mind satisfying a demand because you get value for it, if you like, or you don't get any value at all if you don't do it. I don't mind doing that, but not just because other authorities are doing it. So would you like to have a go, first of all, to see if you can get a Paul Kent, who I've always, I mean, I knew him very well myself. I was on a Dorset Council. But if you can get somebody of that calibre or an adequate calendar without remunerating, then I think that should possibly be the option, irrespective of what other authorities do.
Yes, thank you. Two things. One is Paul Kent was the 151 officer for Dorset County Council, and when he retired, he became the chair, and he is an extremely skilled individual. Obviously, you have to be the 151 officer, and he provided a degree of continuity. We were incredibly lucky, and quite separate to the other discussions, I would like to propose that we send a letter of thanks to Paul, because he has helped us steer us through some quite difficult times. Moving on to my second point, a point I make to a number of people, including the Chief Executive of Dorset Council. This isn't meant as a criticism. Some officers don't quite get the difference between policy and operational. And there is always a danger that we see things, some people may see this sort of thing as operational, and actually it's potentially reputational. I used to be the chairman of a housing association which introduced payment because we found it very difficult to get people to work for us, and paying them something, even relatively small, allows you to hold them to account. I spoke to the chief executive of RNLI and I said, you must have the same problem. And he said, no, we don't. We never pay anybody. That we've got a queue of people who want to work for us. All I'm doing is demonstrating that there are two sides to this argument. I think what we need to do is because the discussions are operational, but the outcome is policy and potentially reputational. May I suggest that we take this outside of this room? Certainly, I take Councillor Legg's point and Councillor Roberts' point that we need to have a clear understanding of the justification that we need to pay this position. My sympathy is we probably do, because there's a difficulty in finding people, but let's get a clear understanding so that when I'm asked, when I knock on somebody's door, oh, you're paying so-and-so, you could be putting that into the pension funds. And it's one of those easy arguments that people make that we need to have a counter. So I personally think I would suggest that you delegate it to the chair and the vice chair to review both the justification for payment and the level of payment against the job specification. Because I think there needs to be a process that we can demonstrate and that you, members, can say, well, okay, we didn't look at it in detail, but we agree that the chair and vice chair. The alternative is that we bring the whole lot back to this committee, and I don't think that's a good use of this committee's time. Can we just, I'd either like to put that on the table as a proposal or just get people to talk about it. Thank you.
I think if we just talk about it for the minute. Aidan, did you want to make a comment there?
A quick comment, yes. Thank you for that. I think that's a really helpful proposal, and I just want to draw out a particular phrase that you use there, Councillor Wolf, against the job description. And I just really want to emphasise the point that this, the chair, it is a job, it's a role, as opposed to just one of our members setting up to host the meeting. I think that's the distinction that we're trying to draw with that. But if the committee is prepared to delegate authority to yourselves, that would be really helpful for us, because we need to move at pace, Karen, don't we?
May I begin by saying how very good it is that we are back in face-to-face meetings. It is absolutely brilliant. I'm the person who advocates face-to-face meetings the most. With respect to your point about advice and trying to get somebody for perhaps a designated role, it may be appropriate to look for somebody who has a dedicated whole career financial services background, AIM-listed company or above. That is the sort of person who we may be looking for on a local basis. But I don't think we should really talk entirely about local today, because I think we do need to get out of the county of Dorset and actually go and meet with our advisors in London. And before I sit down, I'm going to comment on the fact that I'm sure climate change is incredibly important, But I do wonder how many Ukrainians are actually thinking about climate change this morning, and I don't think the Russians ever did. Thank you.
Can we just, can we just make comment that there's a statutory governance of the pension board, and that it has a makeup, and the makeup has partly employers, but also partly scheme member representatives or union bodies. So when we're talking about the makeup, and if we do accept the proposal to give this over to yourselves to make that decision, that's clear in your line of thinking. Thank you.
I must admit, personally, my inclination would be to say probably should try to find someone who would do the work without pay first, and then follow it up. But I don't think it's necessarily incompatible with what Councillor Wolf is suggesting. So obviously Councillor Wolf has made a proposal. Do I have a seconder for that proposal? Okay. Thank you, Councillor Roberts, amongst others. Is everybody happy we proceed that way? Is there a show of hands, please? Anybody against? No. Okay. Well, thank you very much for that. Yeah. Councillor Beasley.
May I just make a comment as one of many who wanted to second the Vice Chairman's proposal, and that is harking back to what we heard earlier with regard to the governance arrangements and the local pensions board. So when Peter Scales was giving us that part of the meeting, we didn't, I think, as a meeting, pick up the issue of accountability, and more importantly, the Pensions Board feeding in on an agenda item to this meeting on a quarterly basis and being reflected in our annual report. I think it would be helpful in terms of this committee and the wider world understanding the work of the Pensions Board, and pension boards are here to stay now, aren't they? And I think it would be helpful if we took up those proposals that were made earlier and fed that into the process, because it's very difficult for members of this committee to really understand value if they don't understand the work and recommendations coming forward from the Pensions Board. So I think that should be fed in at the same time, and I would hope, I can't think of any reason why not, I would hope that our next quarterly committee meeting can receive such an item.
Thank you, Councillor Beasley. Yes, I'm perfectly happy to agree that we do all those matters. I think a key part of the way we operate is to maintain good relationships with the Pensions Board and make sure there's a good two-way flow of information and communications. And what Peter was saying about us receiving the minutes and everything else should be part of that. At the present time, it largely relies on myself going to their meetings, which I've pretty much been to every one of their meetings since I've been chairman, and make sure that the info flows both ways, as I said. So that's good. Karen, did you have anything? Yes, you've still got more to do. So back to you. Another couple of more.
Okay, I'll just finish up briefly on the report. Item 18, we've had Barnett Waddingham do for us an analysis of the LGPS mortality during the COVID-19 pandemic, and this is specific to Dorset County Pension Fund. We did this for several reasons of interest running into the valuation, obviously, and the report is attached. You'll see that the key findings there are male members exhibited significantly higher mortality rate than female pensioners. There was no clear trend in mortality experienced by pension amount, and there was a higher than expected mortality across all pensioner age bands, with excess deaths in the 80 to 85 age band. And there will be some reduction in pension liabilities for the period 1st of February 2020 to 31st of March 2021. So obviously that report only covered up until March 2021. It will be interesting to see what happens to mortality in the following year and going forward. And the actuaries will, of course, be looking at this for us and with us in the valuation coming up this year. Item 19 is the review of the Dorset administration strategy. So we've asked Hymans Robertson to review this for us as part of some governance exercises they're doing for us. and the review is attached to Appendix 3. It was very positive about the administration strategy that we currently have, and obviously pointing the fact that there are changes ahead in several ways that we need to now bring into that. So we will be going through a review of that, and hopefully that will be with you by the next committee meeting. That will be consulted with members and employers. Sorry.
Say something.
Thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to say what Karen can't say, which is that Hyman's are given a glowing endorsement of the work that's been done in-house here. And I've not spoken to the officers about this. And I think like any audit type review, they will find recommendations for changes and improvements. I don't think that takes anything away from the quality of the statement you've got. Now, we know that the regulations are likely to change around this. At the moment, there's no requirement to have an administration strategy. But if you do, then you have to publish it, which is what Dorset does. I think that will change, and I think every scheme will need to have an administration strategy. And as Hyman says, the one at Dorset is a good example, a template for other schemes. So I think there will be a demand for these sorts of things in the coming year when regulations change. Excuse me. So I think it's right that they take forward these improvements, but I also recognise it's another piece of work that we're adding to the work of the team. So my suggestion is that we consider using Hyman's to complete what they recommend, use them to produce for Dorset, which will be a template, an example, working example of good practice for this, and then use that to get a discount from Hyman's on the cost of doing it, because I think this could be used by other funds, you know, as a recommendation on good practice.
I think it's a very good idea. Effectively, it's just that we're a pilot for a nationwide rollout, and as such, we should get a discount because we're doing. Yeah, I see what you're saying. So, I mean, it's something that you're happy to pursue. Yes. Thank you. Any other questions or statements? Okay, back to Karen.
Yes, thank you, Peter. And the final item on the report is just confirmation of the indexation that will be applied to the LGPS and other public sector pensions on the 11th of April this year. This is significant to us in two ways. One, this confirms the increase to our pensions. That's 3.1% that will apply from the 11th of April. This is based on the CPI rate for the previous September, rather than current CPI rate. And it's also the amount that we use as the revaluation rate for existing care accounts. So any pension accrued by an active member under the care scheme is revalued each year. And in the LGPS, we use the same indexation of CPI. So other public sector groups might use something similar. The NHS, for example, uses CPI plus 1.5%. But in the LGPS, it is simply CPI. So that's everything in the report. Does anybody have any further questions? No, thank you.
Thank you for a very thorough report, as always, Karen. I really appreciate that. Thank you very much. Moving on to the item 9, Independent Investment Advisors Report. Steve, over to you.
For it to turn green. Good morning, everybody. My name's Steve Tyson, and I represent MJ Hudson, and I'm your new Independent Investment Advisor, replacing Alan Saunders, who spent many years advising you as a committee and has now retired. And I look forward to working with you on the aims and objectives of the pension fund. Now, my report is tabled in front of you. In fact, I wrote this report in the days when Russia was camped on the Ukraine border, and I had to hand it in for the papers and the distribution on the morning of the invasion, in fact. So, things have moved on quite a lot in the past couple of weeks. I'm happy to take questions on any aspect of the report, but I think what I'd like to do, and I think it will be more relevant, is to give a bit more of a kind of update on what has happened since and how things are developing, and current thoughts on the economy and markets and the strategy of the fund. I think that will be more helpful.
Yes, I certainly think that makes sense. I think the sheer way that things are changing, I think there's huge implications to the announcement overnight that the UAE and other OPEC producers are prepared to step up production to offset the difficulties of make up for the production in Russia that won't be available for the Western countries to buy. And obviously that has another huge impact. It does show that the situation can change literally in a matter of minutes. Steve, over to you to do your best to do a bit of crystal ball gazing.
Sorry, can I ask you a quick question?
Sure, yeah, sorry.
In your report, you say, you wrote it just before the invasion, but you said invasions have a habit of making the, I'm summarising now, have a habit of making the markets drop and then they recover remarkably quickly. It was the sense of what you said. Does that still, okay, I may not have got it quite right. Does that still reflect your general views?
I will come to that in what I'm about to say. The first thing I'd like to say is that it may seem tactless to us all to be talking about money and markets and when we're in the midst of what is essentially a humanitarian crisis. But our job is to the stewardship of the pension fund and the advice of the pension fund. So I'd just like to say, sort of by background, first of all, the economic fundamentals of the global economies post the pandemic were improving rapidly before the war in Ukraine, with a strong labour market, strong consumer recovery, and it was already driving a strong inflationary tendency. But of course, the war is sending a global growth shock as the price of commodities rise. And secondly, there's another dimension, which is that as the sanctions that are imposed inevitably affect the sanctioners as well as the sanctioned, there is a price to be paid for war. What has happened in practice is that equities have sold off sharply, especially in continental Europe. But across the world, and I'll give you some numbers in a second. Credit markets have also fallen. Commodities have soared, inflation will inevitably follow. Q4 had been strong for global equities. They were up 8% in the fourth quarter, and year-to-date global equities are now down 8%. To be honest, these numbers are moving around 2 to a couple of percent every day. So yesterday was a day of a somewhat more recovery, but they're very volatile at the moment. Specifically, the US market year-to-date is down 8%, Europe is down about 9%, emerging market equities, which includes that tiny bit of Russia, are down 5%. The only exception to this year-to-date is UK large cap, which is actually up 1.5% year-to-date. I was quoting some of these numbers as at pre-war in my report, but UK large cap is at 1.5% because there are some big companies there, that are oil companies, that are holding up relatively well. Now, the bond and credit markets are basically were haunted by inflation prior to the war, and are now digesting the global shock. Commodities, as I said, oil, it's bouncing around all over the place. Peaked a couple of days ago. Then, as the chair mentioned, there's a suggestion that more oil reserves may be released, or production may be released from either the Middle East or from shale, things like that, caused the oil price to drop down a little bit yesterday. But I think that's probably going to stay pretty volatile. And the other thing that, just to remind ourselves of, is that things like natural gas prices are always very strong, which has an impact on fertilizer, which impacts food prices. So there is a a very uncomfortable cost of living squeeze that is going to be even furthered from the situation that we saw prior to the war, when there was already going to be a cost of living squeeze. There's lots of talk about stagflation in the markets. Stagflation is a combination of inflation and stagnant GDP growth. So I think this is something we're going to have to live with and digest for a little while. In terms of impact on the pension fund, we heard earlier on about the actual Russia exposure. It's basically de minimis. And Brunel is divesting if it can. So that was discussed earlier in the meeting. But what I think is interesting to talk about is what I would call the indirect exposure. So the portfolio has 50% in equities. Those are obviously down by those amounts I quoted earlier. It has 9% in multi-asset credit and corporate bonds. They'll also probably be down something like of the order of 5 to 10% year to date. However, the rest of the portfolio, it has 6% in diversified returns. Now, I don't know exactly how that fund will be performing just in the very short term, but it should offer some downside protection. 13% in private equity and infrastructure, 10% in property. So those are economically sensitive, but they're not valued in quite like that daily basis that the public listed markets are. And not forgetting that there's 12% in inflation hedging, inflation protection in the portfolio, which is leveraged, and that the value of that portfolio is actually rising at the moment. That's gone from about £450 million to about £485 million when I last checked with Insight last week. So overall, basically the assets have fallen. I can't say what the impact would be on the funding ratio. The actuary is able to smooth some of that. And I'd just like to remind everybody, as you know, that we're coming up to a valuation, the triennial evaluation at the end of this month. So what do I think of the outlook and how should we react? Well, I think in terms of the outlook, I think inflation is probably going to remain high for some time. In the UK, it was expected in February, it was expected to peak maybe around 7 or 8% later this year. There's a suggestion that may be higher than that now. It may peak 8%, 9%, 10%. And all the debate in the markets leading up to the war was about how transitory inflation was going to be, with the central banks arguing this was going to be a transitory effect, a transitory effect, and some market participants concerned that it wasn't going to be a transitory effect. I think how the central banks respond to this inflation will be they've got to thread the eye of a needle. The ECB is meeting today, and the central banks may want to hold off a little bit in terms of the speed at which they were thinking of raising interest rates, but I would still expect interest rates to go up this year. They are mandated to control inflation, and in my view, they have a little bit of catch-up to do from having been slow to raise interest rates in the latter half of last year. I think they have been, to use a phrase, behind the curve. So in terms of the outlook, I mean, I think we're probably going to be in a period of volatility for a little while, and the long term, the consensus around capital market assumptions for the long term is for fairly modest returns. We've been in quite a high return environment for quite a long period of time. We've had very good returns from this and other pension funds. So I think we are going to have a period of volatility and lower returns. But I don't think, to come to the Vice Chair's question, I don't think it's any time to be blown off the kind of long-term course of what we should be doing. And if, when I didn't introduce myself at the beginning of my background. I've been working in the city for 40 years. Well, I was working in the city for a very long time. I was a fund manager and a chief investment officer, and then I've been chairing pension funds and working as a trustee with a spell at Brunel since 2012. I can reflect back on many crises. I've been operating in the markets in many crises in the past 30 or 40 years. And when I look back at those crises, they all eventually presented buying opportunities. Now, I'm not suggesting we go out and buy, risk assets, but, markets have a habit of recovering. If you think back over the most recent one, COVID, March 2020, the markets recovered from that. If we go back over the 9/11 situation, which was another disgusting crisis, or the global financial crisis in 2008, all the ones back through the 90s and the 80s, they've all been situations in which the markets have recovered. And it's impossible to predict what's going to happen in the short term. I think it's impossible to see what the path through the humanitarian and the markets is. But ultimately, I remain an optimist. So I'm happy to take questions on that or questions on the report. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. So it's refreshing to hear people actually say they're optimistic, or they are naturally an optimistic person. It's a really good thing. Too often, I think we focus on the risks. It's part of the job of this committee, I suppose, to do that. But also, we do need to keep our eye on the long-term position. And you're right, all the historical data, going back to as long as there is historical data, shows that equity markets do outperform over long periods of time. And yes, going right back to, I suppose, the Napoleon era or even before that, if you buy a bunch of stocks and hold on to them for a really long period of time, you do well financially. And certainly we're in a position to do that, and we'll carry on doing it, I'm sure. But Councillor Roberts, I think you have a point.
Thank you. I tend to agree that the markets will recover. I'm concerned about short-term inflation. You touched on one side, the fertilizer. Ukraine is the second largest agricultural producer in Europe. It's about 40% of Europe's wheat. But it's also, its biggest export is sunflower oil. And you may not realize the impact of that, but since the EU produced a ban on flea beetle pesticide for our rape crops here, the rape acreage has dropped considerably. We rely on sunflower oil. It's the planting period now, also for sugar beet and potatoes. And if that, because of the invasion, it's going to have a much bigger impact than I think we're estimating on food prices, maybe only for a year, but I think inflation could spike much, much higher because of the impact. China is already trying to source alternative wheat for this year, but the wheat reserves, the CAP, used to keep about 3 months, and the last figure I saw was about 2 weeks. So we don't have those reserves. So it was really the agricultural and food price impact on inflation I wanted to highlight.
I agree, basically. I think, it's the markets and economists are trying to figure out how the inflation is clearly going to go up. So two things. One question is, how high is the peak? And second, I think, which is very important, more important, is how extended is the peak before it then starts to drop back. Because obviously, if it's got a long extension, then that becomes painful for longer. I think people can live through a short peak, but it's going to be very, very uncomfortable for a lot of people. The squeeze on the cost of living, basically.
Yes, for me, the debate is whether the psychology has changed. We've lived in a world of low inflation now, effectively since the late 80s, early 90s, well, probably early 90s. Before that, we had a long period, 20, 30 years of having high inflation and being psychologically used to that. And the question is whether the events of the last year, 2 years, 3 years, is changing the underlying psychology and moving us away from being a low inflation world back towards being a high inflation world. And in which case, the central banks will be wrong. You won't get a spike and a big reversal back down to lower rates. You'll get a consistently higher level of inflation going forward. And I think it's very interesting that the comments have already been made about the stagflation in the 1970s. And maybe we'll go back to that sort of world. And that does potentially have huge impacts on our type of investment portfolio and what we choose to do. but the jury is still very much out on all that at the moment. Councillor Legg was next.
Thank you very much. I want to come back to this market values at the moment. I agree with you that markets nearly always, well, in fact, I was going to say always, because I can't think of an example when they don't rebound. They rebound normally quite quickly after wars and pandemics. They rebound a bit slower, but still within a couple of years, usually after depression. Maybe a bit longer in a couple, but they do rebound. But my question to you is that we've got a very small amount of Russian investment, and let's not take the present value, which is zero. Let's take the value that might have been, a few months ago at £5 million. That's fine, but do you not think that the Russian market will also rebound?
That's a very, very difficult question to answer. I think that, well, ultimately, I think that, well, when I ended by saying I'm a natural optimist, I'd like to think that there's a future that's without Putin in Russia, and that's a future that's, you know, that is better for that country, and you know that would be a totally different environment. So I can't answer that question in the short term. But I hope there's a different future for Russia. Russia is what I'm trying to say. And I'd like to just pick up on the previous point that the chairman made about the inflationary environment and the higher inflation environment sort of going forward. And I think there is one factor which I think was starting even before the recent war, which was that I think we'd been through a period of 30 or 40 years of globalization. Where we were buying the cheapest thing from everywhere, just-in-time inventories, all those sorts of things. And I do think this is another example where I think there's going to be a bit more retrenchment back to local supplies, you know, slightly more nationalistic, and that might cause a higher inflationary background in the future. So I think that kind of just kind of reiterates that point, basically.
Can I just come back quickly on this one? Politically, I fully agree with you, by the way. Yes, I want Putin to go, but I'm not, at the moment, I'm two-faced. Political, yes, he's got to go, and sometimes I think it'd be better to drop an A-bomb on him, but let's not go that far, and we're talking finance here, any pension scheme. But economically, I'm pretty sure that it will come back up. And at the moment, we have assets which are worth nothing at all. And if other people have assets which are worth nothing, economically I'm talking about, please, not political. I quite agree with you politically. Wouldn't it be worth sort of buying those very cheaply from other people? Because they're going to exist anyway. We're not getting the Russian government to pay us back. We're trying to get another purchaser, if you like. And I'm just wondering whether economically it might not be better to say, well, they're going to exist. We cannot kill them off totally. We may as well take ownership of them.
Clearly, Councillor Legg, you like living dangerously. Steve or Luke wants to join in with that as well.
Yeah, so I'm not going to advise that we invest in things that are Russian. So until the environment has totally changed, but it might be worth bringing in Luke in as well on that.
Yeah, just to say, the problem buying these currently worthless assets now is that we don't know what shape the companies or the assets might be in were the current leadership of Russia to change. And so buying a worthless asset now, given that Mr. Putin may well be in power for some time to come, it may well be that you are almost stranding yourself into what you perceive to be an asset for quite some time, and it may well be that those assets change ownership, change structure under a potential new regime in Russia. So putting your foot into the water now is probably still too risky, I would say.
I've still got the light up. Thank you. I was going to say, Howard, when you personally have put a few £1,000 of your own money in, then come back and make the suggestion again, and we might reconsider it. But I have to be that confident before we look at it. Councillor Christopher next.
Yes, clearly it's a question of resources. I'll take issue about the point on stock markets, because after the 7th of December 1941, for a number of years, Wall Street actually rose. So Wall Street actually went against the trend of wars being bad for stock markets. But the point is, clearly there's an issue here about resources. And if it wasn't an issue about resources, it wouldn't have been the case that Tokyo rose 3.94% overnight on the news coming out of the UAE. But we are concerned about inflation. Inflation is high. Inflation is at a level, dare I say it, back to the days when Morgan Grenville were taken over by Deutsche Bank. We're back to early 90s inflation. And clearly it is a concern, because that's what the ONS were telling us at the early part of the year, i.e. that they were talking about input prices inflation of 13.6%, even up from what they were in December. And we need to focus on the fact there will be concerns about resources. But the greatest problem, despite the fact that, as Oda's saying in the book, don't go and fight two battles at the same time, we don't know what Mr. Putin is actually going to do. Or more to the point, nor do his neighbours. Indeed, what will happen in Azerbaijan, in the same way that Dorset Council may have had indirect investments in Russia. BP, for instance, has not insubstantial investments in Azerbaijan. We can say this is not particularly important because it's only the 22nd largest oil exporter in the world. But clearly, if Mr. Putin were to go and do something different, then that would have a fundamental effect on markets, probably even greater than what we've already seen. So the uncertainties are huge. What we can rely on, I believe, is in fact that high inflation is here to stay for quite some time.
Thank you. Just a quick reference to Howard. The Vice Chairman referred to reputational, and I don't think we even go near what our reputation and the echo might make of that. But also, some of us, I suspect, are senior enough to know, with the levels of inflation that are looking, where it paid to borrow to buy things because they cost more a year later than the cost of the borrowing. So I hope we don't get there.
Thank you, Chairman. Just two, if I may. The first is to make it clear that I'm verging on the boundaries of acceptability of talking about Russian investment. I think in today's circumstances, it is pretty much inappropriate. We have assets that are completely stranded. They're likely to have no realisable value, and I cannot see or foresee a circumstance in which any pension fund in this country will be bringing fresh investment into Russia for many, many years at the very least. I hope that we're not going to stray into that territory again. The second is around inflation. And given the change of pension fund advice that we're receiving, but notwithstanding the fact that the situation has and is changing and is likely to change further over coming months and years, I wonder whether we ought to be considering a strategic review around the inflation situation, if only to hear that actually we've got the right strategy in place and that we don't think that that should be altered or enhanced. I know that the spectre of inflation haunts us as a body and always has done, and we're into a phase now, as has been alluded to already, which we are not used to in the last many years. And those of us who remember inflation more than just double digit, but well into the 20%, will have that as a lasting memory. And I'd just like to be slightly ahead of the curve rather than following the crowd. I think it would be important to us and to our position.
Thank you, Councillor Beasley. I think that's a very sensible suggestion, actually, and something we must prioritise in the near future. Okay, I think that's probably a very good discussion we've had there. Thank you very much, Steve. And I think, yes, you helped with a lively debate there, which is good. Moving on to item 10, we have the Fund Administrator's report. And we need to make a change to the recommendations, I believe, as well. So over to you for David's report. Sorry.
Thank you, Chairman. David Wilkes, Service Manager for Treasury and Investments. So conscious of time, I just want to highlight a few of the key numbers in the executive summary, and also, as the Chairman said, just propose that we modify the second recommendation following discussions that we had yesterday at yesterday's training session. So as at the end of 2021, the assets of the fund were worth just under 3.88 billion. Based on Steve's update on markets, etc., I suspect that position would be down as we speak. There's still 3 weeks left to run until the end of the next quarter, so we shall see where we are at the end of the financial year. And as Steve said, that's quite a key milestone in terms of the triennial valuation by the actuaries will be based on the data at that point, although they do employ a kind of smoothing approach to asset values so that it dampens down big market volatility movements. So target asset allocations have been achieved or exceeded in most asset classes. We still have the continuing challenge to get money invested into up to our private market targets. And at the last meeting of the committee approved indicative allocations to two of Brunel's Cycle 3 private market portfolios, one of which was £60 million to private equity and £60 million to infrastructure. So the recommendation today in the report is that we increase that 60 million to infrastructure to 70 million. And this is as a result of capital flows back into the fund we're anticipating for one of our legacy infrastructure managers, which is Hermes. And also yesterday, when Steve presented his initial thoughts, we talked about a suggestion that we also put an allocation to Brunel's secured income portfolio of £20 million. And I think I apologised yesterday, but I apologise again that clearly we would prefer to include these things in reports that you have time to absorb and look at before we come to a meeting. But I think it was just a combination of two factors, really. One is Steve only recently joining, taking up the role, and the timetable for Steve to get around and speak to the various managers, and also the deadline that we have with Brunel in terms of making our commitments to it. So the funding position, the estimated funding position by the actuary was 89% assets, so 89% funding ratio. So the assets, the value of the assets we had at the end of December was anticipated to cover 89% of the expected net present value of the expected benefits accrued to the date. I always caveat those figures in that they are, and Barnett Waddingham, our actuary, would caveat them as well. These are very, very kind of crude estimates. These quarterly figures we get, it's the triennial figure that's the big figure that we look to and that informs our investment strategy going forward. So in the quarter to the end of March, we saw good levels of performance, and we've seen good levels of performance over the last 12 months, both in terms of absolute return, but also compared to the combined benchmark. And over the longer periods of time, we've seen returns, annualized returns over the last 3 years of 10.3%, which outperforming the combined benchmark return of 9.5%. And then over the longer term, we've 5 years, we've seen a return of 7.4%, which is the same as the combined benchmark. As at the end of December, approximately 2/3 of the pension fund's assets are now under the management of the Brunel Pension Partnership. And we, as you know, we have Luke O'Donnell here from Brunel today. So if there are any questions about any of the performance of the Brunel funds, Luke is here to try to answer those questions that you might have. And also in terms of the LDI mandate, probably coming on from the debate and discussion we've had about inflation. So the mandate we have with Insight, it means that approximately just shy of 1/3 of the pension fund's liabilities are hedged against inflation sensitivity using, I think, about 12% of assets. So that's all I wanted to say, other than just to confirm that we'd like to amend the recommendation from approve the revised commitment of £70 million to Brunel Cycle 3 infrastructure portfolio to also include approve a commitment of £20 million to Brunel Cycle 3 secured income portfolio. Thank you, Chairman.
Right, are there any questions for David or for Luke? Adrian.
Can I just ask, the 20 million which has been introduced lately to the party, is this an expression of interest, or are we asking for this committee to give a commitment to take that money forward for next year?
It's the latter. It's so the deadline for making commitments to Brunel's portfolios is 31st of March for this cycle, Cycle 3. There is then an opportunity, if you make a commitment to that cycle, to top up that commitment at March 2023. Otherwise, the next opportunity to make commitments to their funds would be Cycle 4, which will be March 2024.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'm pleased to see the way the asset classes are sort of spreading out, and that our cash balances have sort of dropped down as we were planning from, what was it, 2.2% to 1.1% of the overall portfolio, to about £40 million as at the end of December. I think it's frustrating, isn't it, that it looks like additional funds have gone into infrastructure, but the percentage against the target allocation has gone down because of the growth of the overall fund. And I think that just indicates, doesn't it, how difficult it is to continue to sort of make those infrastructure contributions. They're not sort of overnight switch them on. So it's just a question, these additional allocations, whether they will come from our current sort of cash holdings, and whether we're sort of comfortable with the sort of level of liquidity we've got in terms of the cash we hold in the fund. And the 20 million to secured income, that was being talked about yesterday in relation almost as an alternative to property investment. I think it was sort of talked about in that context. So would we be looking at changes to our property portfolio, or is that for a later decision?
I'll try and remember what order to take those in. In terms of funding these commitments, I mean, once we make that commitment to Brunel, or indeed to any of our legacy private markets managers, it then takes time for them to find the underlying investments to commit the money to, and then it takes time for those underlying investments to call on the commitments that we make. So we'll be making commitments in total of £130 million, I think, to Brunel as at 31st of March. But that money will be deployed probably over a number of years. So the first place that we, and all the time our team are dealing with capital calls, particularly from Brunel now, telling us that we need to find money to invest when those capital calls come in. Now, typically we find that from cash balances. So across the course of the year, we have the best part of £130 odd million worth of contributions coming in, and benefits going out slightly under that. So in the main, we're finding that from cash balances, but we are over our target weighting in a number of asset classes, and if we find that we don't have the cash flows to meet those capital calls, we would then sell down assets where we're over. So, for example, corporate bonds, where target allocation is 4%, where we're actually at 5%.
I think as we previously discussed, things like infrastructure, private equity are very difficult for us to get to our target weightings. In fact, I don't think we've ever managed to do that, because as soon as you get anywhere close to it, you get money being sent back and everything else as well. So we have to even come close to hitting our targets, we have to slightly overcommit in the short term, but knowing that the cash will come back over the next years anyway. Steve, did you want to add anything to that? Or answer the other question about the property as well?
No, that's exactly right about the sort of managing the kind of exposure level. No, it's not an assumption that today we're saying we're going to change the mandate with CBRE, but I think it would be sensible for us to go away and discuss that, because that may be something that we want to consider for the next meeting or the meeting after that. We've got a number of things that I've got on my mind at the moment, and that is one of them that we want to come back to discuss.
Yes, I think that both the, as has been mentioned, I'll say this now, both the relationship with CBRE and our property side of things and the inflation side of things, both need urgent looking at. And it may well be that we need to have some meetings in London with face-to-face meetings with these people and get some ideas about where we want to go forward from doing that. I'll come back to that under item 14 when we deal with the dates of future meetings as well and everything like that. Councillor Roberts was next.
Thank you, Chairman. Councillor Brown asked part of mine, which was the 20 million, because I understand that's a fairly immediate payment, and so that's coming out of reserves. But what I wanted to highlight was I haven't been on this committee forever, but it wasn't very long ago when we celebrated reaching 3 billion, and 3.7, that is a huge increase. And I think congratulations to everybody on securing the future for our pensioners. I'm delighted that, knowing how much we anticipated reaching the 3 billion mark, that we are now so well above that. Thank you.
I think when we were reminiscing at a previous meeting about Alan Saunders' long period of advice with us, I think he and John were saying that I think when he started, or in the early days, the fund was about 800, 900 million pounds, something like that. So it's grown from 800 or 900 million down to 3.8 billion pounds in 15 years or 20 years, whatever it's been. You know, that is a huge growth, and to be commended by everybody involved with that throughout the whole time period. So yes, very good. Howard next.
Thank you. Yeah, my question is on a similar sort of, well, related to that. You refer to these benchmark comparisons in there. All of them, we are positive, except one where we are simply static with it. And it's not just over a 3-month period. Some of them are 5 months, a 5-year as well. So well done for that. That's great. Better than benchmark universally, really. But can we expect a correction of that in the near future? And if not, then why is it we've done so well in your report?
I'll try and answer that. I think probably well, it depends whether you're talking about absolute performance or relative performance against the benchmark. But I would anticipate that, as I said, I would anticipate based on Steve's commentary and others, that I would anticipate that the value of the assets, well, would be lower today than what it was at the 31st of December. What will happen over the next 2 or 3 weeks, I don't know. I mean, casting back 2 years ago, when the restrictions that were put in place by various governments in relation to COVID, the value of the assets fell dramatically in a matter of a week or so, right at the end of the financial year. So I suppose the thing we try to avoid is getting too hung up, if you like, on quarter-to-quarter performance. We do need to look at the longer term trends. They're the ones that really matter. I think the trick is knowing when a shorter term trend is time for action, I think, really. So I suspect that the figures as at the end of March will be depressed on what we've seen at the moment. Well, yes. I mean, for example, you know, I think it was Councillor Christopher talked about the fall in various stock market indices. So where our investments are benchmarked against indices, I suspect that the absolute performance will have fallen, but the benchmark that we compare against will have fallen as well.
Can I come back? Sorry. I wasn't comparing the market direct. I was comparing with the benchmark, which will go up, have the same sort of effect on it, if you like. You've done, or we've done rather well compared with the benchmarks we've adopted, as I say, over just months as well as years. And I'm just wondering why. You know, how can we do that? And yes, the markets of all sorts might fall before the end of March, but so will the benchmarks. And if we still perform better than them in comparison, then you're doing very well. How come this can happen? Or will there be a setback relative to benchmark in the future, do you think?
Fundamentally, I think compared to benchmark, it's down to the performance of the underlying fund managers. That we've been actually quite good at having choosing managers, both the legacy ones, which we chose ourselves, and Brunel so far as well, choosing the right managers who have delivered a good solid performance. And I remember certainly we have, despite what I say there, I think we've been quite good as well at removing fund managers who underperformed, people who consistently were not giving the returns that we wanted. And if you look at the list of managers we have today with what they were 5 or 6 years ago, they're virtually completely different. And I know part of that is Brunel, but a lot of it would have been recognising that we were happy to get rid of managers who didn't perform. And I think that is a key part of it. Luke, did you want to add things?
Certainly, just to say, if everything stays as it is until the end of March, which of course is a crucial date for you, there will be a diminution in the value of the assets that Dave's referred to, and drilling down into perhaps a bit more minutiae than you possibly require, some of the equity funds or some of the equity fund managers, and therefore the equity funds that you have holdings in, have more of and I apologise for getting into jargon, a growth bias than a value bias. And over the last 3 months to date, possibly 4 months or so, growth companies have suffered more than cyclical value type companies that have done well. So if things stay the same, there are another 20 days in the quarter. I would expect on the very short term performance that a number of the Brunel strategies possibly perform worse than their benchmarks. Over the longer term, I think the Brunel strategies, the global equity strategies, probably have enough baked-in outperformance to weather this short storm. So 3-year rolling numbers should be okay, touch wood. But certainly over this short period, the 90 days to the end of March, if things stay the same, I ought to give you perhaps a slight profits warning or performance warning.
I think it's always difficult to when you've got a good, solid long-term strategy in place that's delivering over the long term, when there are shocks to the system, which might be for a few months or a couple of years, it's often very difficult in those highly volatile situations for funds to do well. But the important thing is that we've made the right long-term decisions, and that's delivered for us. And I think, looking forward, I think we're still making the right long-term decisions as well, broadly speaking. Councillor Wolf has something to say as well.
Sorry, just coming back to the point about terminating relationships with underperforming funds, I can remember our discussion and the heartache we had the last time we terminated, which I think has turned out to be a particularly good decision in hindsight, and I said I thought so at the time. I also said that we needed to continue doing this pour encourager les autres, because I'm a great believer in that, to keep people sharpening their pencils. And I'm sort of straying into the next item, the Brunel report, where they failed to meet benchmark either in the quarter or for the year. And I must admit, I am concerned that Brunel don't sharpen their pencils enough and don't terminate contracts with underperforming suppliers. So I know Councillor Beasley is going to talk to that, but when Councillor Beasley comes to that, I would like some confirmation from Brunel, because I think sometimes you start talking about the wrong things and don't talk about the right things, which is providing a return for our customers. And we need to go back to basics on that, please. And I see some nodding from our advisor and others. So I think I may have touched on a point worth mentioning. Thank you, Chairman.
Actually, as you mentioned this now, I think it would be all right to discuss this right now. I think the Councillor Beasley's report is slightly different from what you're talking about there, with issues of management and stuff like that, issues with fund managers. But do you want to comment on what Councillor Whopper said?
That wasn't actually the reason I indicated. I wanted to speak about something else on this report. However, having said that, I wasn't proposing, because I don't think it's part of my brief, to get into investment performance per se. And I'm sure that Luke O'Donnell from Brunel can help us on that particular point. I'd prefer to have that division, because I think otherwise I stray over the boundary of what I'm there to do. What I was wanting just a quick word about was, and it follows on from yesterday's presentation and the comments that Steve Tyson was making to us online, it is around our property and our target asset allocation of 10%. And I just wanted to be clear out of this meeting, Chairman, that we, notwithstanding what you said earlier about our future work programme, that we are going to have appropriate time in which to have a meaningful discussion around property, and most particularly about CBRE, who have served this fund very, very well over a number of years. And I'm just anxious, I think, that about two things. One is that we, with the pressure of everything else, don't actually manage to allocate sufficient time to understand all the nuances and the way we're going. And most particularly around the completion of our transition into Brunel, of course, where we slightly lag the curve against the other funds generally. But also, I think, to make sure that we all fully understand CBRE's brief and their strategy. Because if we don't understand that, and we don't actually give them the opportunity, as we do with other fund managers, then I think we will be missing quite an important point. I'm not saying that we shouldn't review, I'm not saying that we shouldn't change, picking up the Vice Chairman's point, a point he often makes, and quite rightly too. But having said that, there are some star performers as well, and some who have embedded and given us a consistent return, and indeed always managed to communicate very closely with us as a committee. I wouldn't want to see that arbitrarily changed, and I'd like to make sure we have enough time allocated in which to do that.
I think we're very aware of that, and I think as I indicated, I've been very conscious that when we're looking at the bigger picture, that we both have a real good look at inflation and have a real good look at property as well. And if anything, that can start even before we get any recommendations from our future advisors about where we should be investing in things, because we know we will have some exposure to inflation and some exposure to property, no matter what their recommendations are, whether they go up or down in our total exposure, but they're going to be a key part of what we do anyway, so we can certainly work on. Luke, did you want to add anything?
Yes, I was just going through the quarterly report that we produce, and I would think that the Councillor's concerns are to do with the global high alpha equity portfolio and the global emerging market portfolio. In those two instances, first of all, looking at the global high alpha portfolio, the manager that has disappointed of late has been the Baillie Gifford exposure. Baillie Gifford have taken a style agnostic but very long-term view. They do back growth type entities if that doesn't quite go against the idea that they're style agnostic, and the Bailey Gifford strategy, given their emphasis on growth, has been disappointing. The Global Emerging Market strategy has a manager within it called Genesis. Genesis were appointed predominantly to give downside protection when emerging markets have trickier times, and hitherto the Genesis position has not delivered that protection that we appointed them for. So please, could the whole of the chamber be very aware that I have noted the comments that we have not sharpened our pencils enough, but our liaisons with Bailey Gifford and Genesis, and to a lesser degree Wellington, have been very, very frequent, and hitherto we haven't decided yet that either of those mandates need to be terminated. It is obviously very disappointing when you see the performance numbers that we also see, but please be assured that we have those two managers in particular, very much under the microscope.
Are there any other points on this? So, Councillor Brown.
Thanks, Chair. It's on a slightly different just section of the report about the funding update, section 11, about Barnett Waddingham's triennial revaluation. I think I probably know the answer, but almost for the record, obviously, you know, a lot of our portfolios are experiencing short-term impacts at the moment because of what's going on in the world. But we have this fixed date of the 31st of March this year for the triennial valuation by Barnett Waddingham. Obviously, I don't think, I'll double check, that can't be moved, that can't be changed because of short-term impacts. But just in terms of how that will be managed, because obviously the valuation is almost a snapshot in time, and you know, who knows what the future holds, but there may be a recovery. By the time all the work is done and the report is out, things could have changed quite significantly. How will that be managed by Barnett Waddingham in terms of their reporting? Because obviously, if it's a low valuation because of short-term impacts, that can quite seriously impact what employers have been asked to contribute to the fund and what members may be asked, those sorts of some quite significant decisions by employers and members in the coming years. So just wanted to sort of clarify the position around that.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Brown. I'll just try and answer that. So I think probably tackle it in two ways, really. One is that Barnett Waddingham's methodology in terms of asset valuation is they don't actually take the same valuation of the assets that we do at a snapshot on a point in time. They look to smooth the valuation by looking at how markets and asset classes have moved or performed in the preceding 6 months, or sorry, the preceding 3 months and the next 3 months after. So they look at, they do smooth it out. So they do take account of the volatility that can be in market valuations. Probably the more important thing is when they're looking at their valuation moving forward, they're looking at investment, what they believe the different asset classes are going to return over the longer term. So they're also looking at that when they're doing the valuation as well. So they're looking at what they think those asset classes are going to earn in the future. And sometimes in the past we've had what seems slightly counterintuitive is that when markets have done really well, they've then dampened down their return expectations moving forward, and vice versa the other way as well. So that's a simplistic kind of summary of what they will do. We will at some point ensure that the committee have at least one session with the actuary prior to them concluding their valuation process. And I know a number of you listened to their initial presentation that they gave to the local pension board, which was open to committee members as well. So there will be an opportunity to raise those questions directly with Barnet Waddingham in the coming months.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to move on. So we've had a change in the recommendation. Do you want to briefly remind people what you're now proposing under item 2?
So the recommendation that's there is to sorry. Apologies. So the revised recommendation will be approve the revised commitment of £70 million to Brunel's Cycle 3 infrastructure portfolio and approve a commitment of £20 million to Brunel's Cycle 3 secured income portfolio.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I'm conscious of time, but there are a few things to get through. But just first of all, picking up on the comments made by Luke O'Donnell from Brunel just a moment ago and the Vice Chairman's comments. As usual, the next Oversight Board meeting of Brunel is Thursday of next week. So we're in exactly the wrong place to be completely up to date. But what I would ask of Luke is to have a conversation with David Vickers, who's the Chief Investment Officer for Brunel, and ask him, please, to highlight these issues of underperformance against benchmark at the Oversight Board meeting next Thursday. Because I think in his piece in that meeting, he might like to give a little bit more time than he would usually and get greater emphasis on it, just to pick up the point, with which I completely agree. And it's the example we try to set through this committee. Turning to matters of Brunel, there have been actually 2 meetings of the Oversight Board since we last met as a committee. The first of those was on the 2nd of December, and there's not a lot to report out of that, other than we had some very useful and interesting information around the outcome of COP26 and feedback from Brunel's presence there, which I think proved to be extremely worthwhile, particularly given Brunel's prominence in that part of the market. And we also had an investment topic paper around investment in China. And it's a sort of progression that we try to get information coming over a little bit like we do on this committee here. The more recent meeting was on the 27th of January, and much of that meeting was around Brunel's budget and its new initiatives. And I thought I'd just spend a moment just explaining those, because outside of the investment piece, it's important to understand, I think, that the management of Brunel is under scrutiny from the Oversight Board, but the ambition is still there and being encouraged by the Oversight Board. So in terms of the budget, there was a long discussion over it, and I think some of the original intentions managed to be scaled back. I think there was a proper understanding of how the 10 constituent funds felt about a widening budget, and so we pressed, I think, pretty hard over that. But we also wanted to understand what else are we going to get for our money. And so a number of things are coming forward. I'll just give you an example, which is Brunel's climate stocktake, which is a really important part of the work being undertaken, but doesn't come without cost, and really is trying to look out through engagement with interested parties, be those the constituent funds, be those the trade unions, etc., around whether actually their approach to climate investment is actually working. and I think it's important to draw a line in the sand and get to that position. So that is being undertaken. But getting back to the budget itself, I think we ascertained there are three key initiatives which are providing the growth items within the budget, all three of which gained the support of the Oversight Board after debate. The first is the priority of private markets and the associated due diligence, because obviously private markets, by their very nature, require more due diligence than perhaps some others, is promoting Brunel to continue and expand on being a leader in ESG and RI issues across the industry. Now that comes at a cost, but we think it's a cost worth paying on the basis that this does require leadership, and certainly one of the pools has to provide that leadership. Others may be doing a great deal too, but Brunel want to do that, and of course want to make sure that we can do the things that a lot of our members want us to be doing, which we know we're doing anyway, but we need to make sure that we carry on expanding that agenda, Chairman. So that's been an important part of it. I do think actually that Brunel could do more to publicise that. Quite difficult from the centre across 10 funds. Perhaps some of that could be, if you like, given to us and given to the other 9 funds so that we can sort that out more locally. But we do need to be stepping up that publicity around the agenda to demonstrate not only we're attuned to it, it isn't fine words, but we are actually doing it. And we're doing it in a number of diverse ways, which are making a difference and will have an effect. So I'd certainly encourage that. And the third one was much more around compliance as Brunel diversifies into more funds and establishes its real sense of direction. So I think there's quite a big compliance piece in there, which is obviously taking up additional resource. One of the things that we did do was to ask them to look long and hard at this budget in terms of the contingency that's been built in year on year, some of which actually has not needed to be spent and has come back into the budget, quite a substantial amount. And I think the argument has been, in terms of containing budgets, that contingency needs to be reduced. And it's been reduced from 5% to 3%. And I think the intention is to reduce it further in later years. That means that the cost of running Brunel, if you like, will have escalated in the coming year's budget by 5.3%. So it has been scaled back from the original intention, which was considerably higher than that. But I think that we're going to get value for money from that for the reasons that I've just been setting out. Certainly looking to what has been achieved by the work that Brunel has been doing. Just a couple of snapshot figures, if I may. And these are just off one of the papers that came with us. Based on the assets that have been transitioned, which across the 10 funds is about 80%. To remind you, Dorset is about 2/3, actually. So we're lagging the curve a bit, partly because of our infrastructure and property investments and perhaps some private equity. That's not an embarrassment, it's just that it gives us an idea of how far and how fast Brunel has travelled in a very short space of time. Net fee savings, that is after the costs of the budget, which I've just demonstrated, come at 13 million. And the budget itself, therefore, if we gross that up, comes to savings of 24 million. That is going to improve over time because a lot of what's in the budget, because of the economies of scale, of course, is going to show us a greater return than it does at the moment. And we're certainly breaking even on where we had anticipated being over the time. And there are very considerable tax savings as well, which have been made, some £17 million in 2021, which again have exceeded expectations. So, Chairman, that's just a snapshot. It's always going to be historic for us here in Dorset. because, as I say, the next meeting is Thursday of next week, whereas the Scheme Advisory Board, on which I also sit, is very current because that was only the Monday of this week. So we can't have it both ways, I suppose. But if anybody's got any questions, Chairman, happy to try and answer them.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that very thorough report, as always. Thank you. Any questions? No? Okay, good. Thank you very much. Moving them on to item 12, the External Auditors Report. David.
Thank you, Chairman. Councillor Roberts referred to the milestone of getting the assets through £3 billion. This is probably a milestone as well, in that we've actually got the final audit report for our 19-20 accounts. I shared the draft report with you, I think, at the September meeting, and it's largely unchanged from that. So just to clarify that the auditor will be issuing an unqualified audit opinion on the financial statements of the pension fund for 19-20, and as also believes there's no inconsistencies between our financial statements and our annual report. There are a couple of things in there that weren't in the draft report, which relate to their IT audit findings. So they had a finding on user access rights and a finding on password settings. Karen Gibson, the pensions manager, has responded on both of those points, and they're shared in the executive summary. It's also, again, another sign of how long it's taken for the auditors to complete this, that we now have the new pensions administration systems in place. So the findings are largely irrelevant now anyway. So the only other thing to say on a less positive note is that we're still awaiting the 2021 audit report for the pension fund, but also for the host authority for Dorset Council's main accounts as well, which continues to be disappointing. We continue to chase them on a regular basis. I think this problem does not relate just to Dorset and just to our auditors, Deloitte. It's across local government, not just local government pension schemes, that this is a challenge. I think we talked earlier about trying to get the right staff in place in administration, trying to get the right staff in place in other aspects of the council. It's also a challenge for the audit profession as well. I think our Deloitte have got a very high number of vacancies, I think, that they've informed us on recently. So it's good news, in summary, good news for 1920 that we finally have got our final audit report and there are no major findings within it. And there's still a frustration that we still haven't seen the similar report for 2021.
Thank you, David. I mean, this is obviously very frustrating for all those involved. And I certainly thank the work that's been done at Dorset Council level on the main council accounts as well. I'm very conscious of the time, so if people could say things as briefly as they possibly can, it would be helpful. So, but Aidan first, or Jim, whichever.
Have I pressed the right button? Chair, I was just going to kind of emphasise some of the points that David had made there. We're in regular contact with Deloitte for not just the pension fund audit, but for Dorset Council's audit as well. Whilst it does seem counterintuitive that we're here celebrating today something that relates to nearly 2 years ago now, and that is where we are. Collectively, the audit sector is trying to respond to the recommendations of the Redmond Review, building capacity. We do know our own auditor better than the others, obviously, and they have talked, as David has said, about a significant lack of capacity locally and nationally, particularly in local government audit, which is extremely complex. So yes, we continue to have those conversations. The Deloitte work in particular is further complicated by the fact that they are also under review with the Financial Reporting Council, and the audit of Dorset Council's accounts for 1920 is one of the things that's under review. Not that there is anything specifically to have been drawn to their attention by Dorset Council's accounts. It's part of a regular review, so they're reluctant to sign off anything whilst they're in that process. But contact is pretty much one way at the moment. We're not getting field work being done either for the pension fund or Dorset Council. We think most of it has been done, but David has reported back to this committee before for the pension fund. We think everything is done, and then there appears to be a Colombo moment, just one thing. And we think the majority of that is discontinuity of staff and lack of continuity of process through it. So we are still on it. Our partner has, audit partner at Deloitte, has agreed to appear here if you want to. If you wanted to write to him, he will respond to clarify everything that I've just said. So he's open to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I won't take very long. Suffice to say, I chair BCP Council's Audit and Governance Committee, and there's another member of the committee here today in the form of Councillor Brown. It's creating immense frustration for us. There are two areas whereby our external auditors, Grant Thornton, are unable to sign off our 2021 accounts, and one of those two reasons is around Deloitte's inability to sign off in terms of the pension fund. And I would be failing in my duty if I didn't raise that this morning, to use every endeavour, as I know Aidan Dunn and his team are doing, but to use every endeavour to push Deloitte to at least try to resolve that issue, because we are just coming up to the anniversary on the 1st of April, and we'll then be into another year and no doubt another year's audit. And so therefore it's proving embarrassing not only for Dorset Council, but for BCP Council as well, and particularly for the Audit and Governance Committee.
Thank you. I think you can rest assured, all of you, that we are fully supportive of any work that you do to improve the situation. And if we can help with anything in terms of people coming to talk to us or whatever, explain the situation, we'll be more than happy for you to do that. As long as we make some progress in getting these matters resolved, that's the important thing. Okay, thank you very much for that. Then on to item 13, the Treasury Management Strategy. David again.
Thank you, Chairman. This, just paging through to it. Thank you, Chairman. So this is an annual report that we bring to the committee, and the Treasury Management Strategy is effectively the parameters within which we manage the cash balances of the pension fund. So although the pension fund has no strategic allocation to cash, we do have significant cash flows that come in and out of the pension fund. So this purely sets the parameters in terms of what kind of investment vehicles we can put those sums of money into, and the limits on those, and that's it really.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to clarify, I don't have an issue with the Treasury Management Strategy at all, really. Just wanted to double check. It talks in there about this report revises last year's that was agreed. Is there any particular sort of revisions that we need to note or be aware of? Because I'm not quite sure. And just also, it talks in the report about our Treasury Management Advisors, Arlene Close, which is obviously what Dorset Council currently employ. Just on what regularity do we review our advisors? I know there's probably not that many advisors in that marketplace, but yeah, when do we review those advisors?
I think the contract that we had with them was for 3 years, with the possibility of extending for a year. As you say, it's quite a small niche market of the advisors. The other main player being, well, they've gone through various name changes, but I think they're now Link Asset Services. So I've worked with Arlene Close and Link, Dorset Council, Dorset County Council, and other local authorities, and I would say they're both very good. They give us very good advice in terms of managing cash balances. But obviously, they're mainly employed by the main local authority, so advice in terms of our borrowing for the Dorset Council as well. there is one actually, which is in 1218, which is the minimum of cash well, not cash, the cash equivalents that we have available. Last year that was £10 million. We've increased that to £20 million, and the reason for doing that basically comes back to the conversations we've had earlier about how do we fund these drawdowns into our private market by our private market managers. So it's just given us ensuring that we have what we don't want to be in the situation is having to sell assets at short notice in order to fund these allocations. So we felt it was prudent just to increase that, give ourselves a bit more room on that.
Right, if there's anything else, then on to item 4, dates for future meetings. Now, firstly, I have to start off by giving an apology. I'm as frustrated as many of you are as well by the fact that this meeting did not take place in London as we had hoped and intended it to do. The brief explanation was a few weeks ago I was contacted by officers that Dorset Council had taken the decision that they wanted to further encourage participation by the public in meetings, which had increased considerably with the technology that we're now using today. And people got far more involved in their committee meetings and watching what our proceedings are. Unfortunately, due to the nature of the technology, it is not very portable. If we were to try to take this to London and operate it in someone's office, we would require making sure that our van and 2 members of staff would have to go with it to maintain it and operate it. It's also been expressed to me that the fund managers that we would likely hold our meetings, office meetings in, are increasingly lacking in willingness to have members of the public turning up at their offices to observe our meetings, which of course any member of the public has the right to come to any of our meetings, and just because they didn't used to come in the past doesn't necessarily mean they wouldn't come in the future, but because of the rise in the environmental issues. So it makes it much harder for us to hold meetings in London. I was not overly happy with this advice, and I had a meeting with Democratic Services and with our IT staff who basically informed me that we had very little choice in the matter and that we needed to move this meeting back to being held here. And then we decided because of that to then hold the training session online, which is what we did yesterday. I'm not overly happy with this. I know, as I say, that several members are disappointed and have contacted me also about this. It has been suggested that, of course, we could go down the route of having a training session in London anyway, just for training. And certainly I've noticed the desire on your part to talk about the property side of things and to talk about the inflation side of things. And they would be good subjects that we could really get our teeth into, and we could build a good 2-day program around seeing them and maybe some other people as well. But that is the explanation of why this has happened and why we're here, and why in the future all the dates are showing us as being here and not in London in our public meetings. I'm happy to take any questions or any comments on that.
Thank you. A couple of points. I totally agree that the face-to-face meetings with the fund managers have been probably one of the most informative aspects of this committee, and I would hate to see us lose that opportunity and the networking opportunities that. Just 2 points. I've actually, in discussions with the Vice Chairman, said that possibly we could split them and go for training and possibly hold meetings. I chair an outside body on which I represent Dorset. We find locations where this can be done. They don't have to be in fund manager offices, but there are plenty of locations that now have the IT technology that may be only a half-hour ride from somewhere where we are in London that has that facility for people to take part on a hybrid basis. And also, usually the practice was to go twice a year, so we always held 2 meetings here. So I'm not quite sure we're going to disenfranchise people that much. I do believe meetings used to take place in Scotland at one time in an earlier era, but I'm not suggesting that. But I think there's 2 options. Either we go to London for the training and have the meetings here, or we look for a venue that may well have those facilities, because I'm sure it's happening more and more. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd probably support those comments by Councillor Roberts just now. I think it is invaluable actually when we've been to London. I've obviously only been on the Pension Fund Committee a few years now. Weather also, I understand previously members have been and visited some of our property investments in the area when they've done those trips. I haven't. I've been here a few years. Whether that could be tied into the agenda at one of the sort of trips as well.
Yes, looking at the property investments, there's nothing like kicking the tyres. The investment organisation whom we terminated their contract, we actually spent 2 hours them making presentations, and they knew the contract was up for new renewal. And you couldn't do that in this setting. You just couldn't do it at all, because we had a really detailed 2 hours. And when we took the decision to terminate, I felt very comfortable that we've taken all of the right steps and we've been completely open. So I would like to see us, if not proposing an amendment, all I can see is 4 dates all here. I want to change that, and we need to change that so that we do have, 1 or 2 meetings in London whereby A, we meet the fund managers, B, we meet other people, we have internal discussions, we look at properties, we meet any fund managers that we think are underperforming to get into the skin of it. And I think we need to have at least one of those 4, if not 2, in London. I spoke to Democratic Services, and I'm glad we're not falling out about this. I spoke to Democratic Services and I spoke to the leader. The desire was an aspiration. It was not, you must not do this ever. The meetings have to be open to the public. I understand that. Personally, I do not think it's beyond the wit of man to set up a camera and to have a streaming of that. It's what you do in Parliament. You only allow a very small number of people in, so we can stream that meeting to a wider audience, and that doesn't require permission from the investment fund manager, because there won't be the public coming in, but the public can submit questions and get them answered, as they do at the moment. And that's the only thing. They can't engage in debate, so we're not disenfranchising. They can still do that. So I think we should look into having 1 or 2 future meetings, and meetings I use in a sort of general sense, over the next year in London or wherever it is required that we're looking at properties or whatever. And I think I suggest, again, may I suggest that you leave that to the Chair and the Vice Chair to discuss with the Section 151 officer and David Wilkes to try and identify which ones, where and when. And I do suggest that, we talk to our colleagues in BCP so that their views are part of this, because I'm really keen that this is a wider agreement, not just one person's view. Thank you, Chair.
I'd just like to draw attention to Mr. Scales' report earlier, saying that there's an absolute requirement for the pension board to have training, and that's likely to come to us. So I entirely agree with our approach of having something positive towards training. Personally, I found it very useful, the trips that we've been to London, and so the training that we had with Insight on the liability-driven investments was excellent, and I'd appreciate having that sort of training again. Thank you.
Well, I think you've all clearly expressed your point. Sorry, Councillor Christopher.
Very briefly, and I don't know if I've ever said this before, I agree with Councillor Wharf and Councillor Roberts in every respect. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think you've made your views very clear, and the officers, I'm sure, will have heard what's been said and the need to find a way to make this work. We will do everything we can to make sure that it is made to work the way we want. Thank you very much. That finishes the public meeting. So if you stop the broadcasting, please. Thank you. We need to move